Hello, I'm John Carlin, the chair of the Aspen Digital Cybersecurity Program, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the 5th annual Aspen Cyber Summit. Normally, for this summit, we'd gather in person in a place like Boston, New York, or San Francisco to spend a day talking together with some of the most informed people inside and outside government about the online threats our nation and our world face. This year, unfortunately, I'm joining you from my living room instead, an appropriate setting, given the world's rapid transition this spring to socially distanced working from home environment amid the pandemic. A global health crisis that has had profound implications for technology and the internet, from cloud computing to ransomware to the US presidential election, as we'll hear and discuss over the coming days. Over the next 3 days during the summit, we'll talk about the most pressing challenges facing the modern digital world, hearing from more than 40 speakers across federal and state government, the private sector, academia, and civil society. I want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations and to help us understand such a complicated year. We would also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SIGPA-NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. It seems like in a particularly important year, maybe unprecedented, to have conversations like these. And while we've worked on these digital security issues together for years now, I don't think the world has ever had an instance where they've been more dependent for work, for play, for holidays, for safety on digital technology. And we're grateful to FireEye, Intel, Proofpoint, Blue Vector, SIGPA-NA, and the American Gas Association for how understanding how important these convenings can be. The full summit agenda and bios of all our speakers are available at aspencybersummit.org. We have a great day ahead of us today, including conversations with Cloudflare's Michelle Zatlin and former Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Sue Gordon, alongside Alex Stamos, the former Chief Security Officer for Facebook and the founder of the Stanford Internet Observatory. Over the next 2 days, you'll also hear from the Director of the Secret Service, the Chief Information Security Officers from 2 companies on the front lines of developing a COVID-19 vaccine, and certainly our hopes and prayers are with them, as well as my successor as the Justice Department's head of national security. Informed by events like these and the conversations that take place, we'll also be announcing this week for the first time the Aspen Cybersecurity's National Cybersecurity Agenda, designed to help set the stage for action by the incoming Biden administration and the new 117th Congress. Again, join us all week at aspencybersummit.org. For today and throughout the summit, we'll have the Zoom Q&A function enabled to hopefully allow for the type of dialogue that we encourage when we meet in person. So please feel free to submit questions, comments. And now I'm pleased to introduce Kara Swisher, the host of the Sway podcast at the New York Times, in conversation with Matt Travis, the recently former Deputy Director of CISA, DHS's main cybersecurity agency. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. How are you all doing? Thank you so much for having me here. And I'm very excited to interview Matt Travis, someone I've wanted to talk to a lot about cybersecurity and other issues. And we've got a lot to talk about. Welcome, Matt. Thank you for appearing here.
Thanks, Kara. Good to be with you. And thanks to Aspen for the invitation.
I like your Spinal Tap thing behind you in your hallway.
I've been relegated to the basement since my kids are in home learning, and this was the lightest corner I could find. So
okay, this is fantastic. All right. Okay. It gets a 9 on Room Rater. Anyway, let's start beginning to talk about recent times. I want to talk about where it's going and everything else, and the walk up to the election. But first, I think everyone is most interested. Obviously, you resigned after Chris Krebs was fired at the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency. So why don't you walk us through 2 weeks between the election and Krebs's firing, and what was it like to be inside CISA, and what you were all talking about in that as that time period unfolded?
Sure. I'll go back 4 weeks. So the election was 4 weeks ago today. And
Right.
Because of the pandemic, we knew that the results process would be protracted because of the mail-in voting. And so we were kind of gaming out some of the contingencies that we'd want to be prepared for. And the first several days after the election were quiet because it was still, states hadn't really called for either candidate, number of key states. And we got through the weekend when most major, I think AP first called it for President-elect Biden. And it wasn't really until that next Tuesday, it was the day before Veterans Day, when Politico dropped a piece Tuesday night about essentially, here's the government agency you've never heard of that's countering the president's lawyers' claims about impropriety or fraud in the election. And I remember that night texting Chris when I saw that. I saw it first, and I said, if this doesn't get you fired, nothing will. And his response back was essentially, yeah, this might do it. Now, the next day, Reuters wrote a story saying he had told people that he expected to be fired. My texting wasn't the source of that.
Right, but this was an agency that people were aware of that had been monitoring these issues.
But Kara, I got to tell you, we were 2 years old agency, so I think still technically the youngest federal agency on the civilian executive branch. And most people who don't work with us probably had not heard of CISA. I think we were getting a little bit more attention as the election day drew on, and certainly Chris and Acting Secretary Wolf were making appearances kind of promoting the best practices for what to expect on the election. But we generally had tried to fly under the radar, knowing how fraught with peril this election might be because of the non-traditional way that the votes would eventually be tabulated and the timing really of that.
Right. Well, let me ask, were you more worried about the non-traditional way because of the COVID issue, or were you worried about Trump's continued politicization of this issue? Because leading up to the election, he had been doing that actively on Twitter and other places.
Certainly. And we tried to kind of filter out that noise. We were mostly concerned with knowing that because of the heavy mail-in balloting, that you would not have an election night result. And we would say as much. It's going to take several days, if not a week, before we know the winner, and try to inform the electorate about the process and what to expect, and not to get overly anxious about that. But obviously, as the days wore on and kind of the rhetoric coming from the president's campaign continued to kind of contradict what we saw and what we knew to be the case, we recognized that the tension could continue to probably grow. And so when Politico kind of called it out in the open, that was really the first straw. And then there were a number of articles in the days forth. Now, the next day on Veterans Day is when White House personnel called our chief of staff to inform her that the White House was going to ask for Brian Ware's resignation. Brian was our assistant director for cybersecurity.
Who had made public comments, about that.
I don't know if it was that. I mean, we all went through I don't know what it was, frankly, Kara. We all went through the re-vetting, if you will, over the summer with White House personnel. And I think not knowing, that's Brian's story to tell, but we certainly pressed that it'd be silly to change the CISA team, not only when we're running point on election security, but also on Operation Warp Speed, which Brian was the lead on, working with the healthcare sector and vaccine suppliers. So our chief of staff asked, is that the only one? And this is Wednesday, so this is Veterans Day. And my understanding was the answer was that's it. And so we thought, okay, well, let's keep going.
And he resigned, by the way.
He resigned effective that Friday. Big loss. Both he and Jeanette Manfra were just tremendous leaders of what is the new cybersecurity division within CISA. And so I think David Sanger ran a profile on Chris on Friday, and Garrett had written an article, and then on Washington Post editorial board on Sunday. And so we knew that with each article that we're calling attention to CISA's and specifically our rumor control website, that it may be continued difficulty in navigating a narrow path to.
But the whole point of your rumor control and all your efforts were to publicize the safety of the election and your assessment. So hiding under a rock really isn't an option for your group, correct?
No, we weren't. Yeah, we're not trying to hide under a rock. And frankly, Chris got the idea on the rumor control from FEMA. They use that in terms of trying to bat down rumors during hurricane season and getting ground truth out. So we thought, hey, that's a good idea that we implemented. But we frankly expected that to be used against foreign adversaries, what we saw from Russia in 2016, that disinformation campaign of using fake personas online and putting out falsehoods to swat those down, but also to educate the voters about the electoral process. We've been working closely with the entire election community for 3 years, and we wanted to show transparency in terms of, if this happens, this is what it means, and if this happens, don't be alarmed. And that was really the purpose of that rumor control. Just
to give accurate information out.
Yeah,
but when the president was tweeting out before and saying things publicly, it was a lot on Twitter, but he did it a lot of places in his rallies. Did that worry you, that they were doing things counter for what was on your website?
We took the stance that we didn't need, it wasn't our role to fact check the candidates. That we were going to stay out of that political process, and the candidates and the media can hold them to account, or others. But once the election had been conducted, and the electoral process of canvassing and of counting and of certifying was in place, then we felt it was our role to be articulating the ground truth on what these processes entailed and what security protections had been built into these systems. And so to answer your question though, Carrie, yeah, it wasn't helpful, but we kind of expected that, probably not to the extent and the volume of it, and how long it continued. So just to continue the week then, it was on Tuesday. Monday was very quiet. So this is 2 weeks ago. Tuesday was also pretty quiet. It was business as usual at CISA. We had a lot going on. People probably maybe not realize it's not just the cyber domain. We've got responsibility for the physical protection of infrastructure, all 16 sectors. And we also have an emergency communications role. So we have a lot going on. It was business as usual. And then on Tuesday night, about 6 o'clock, I think it was the Washington Examiner put out a story that cited some White House sources. And they made a kind of a crass joke about Chris's hair. So we were giving him grief over that. And that was probably about 6 p.m. 7:15 is when Chris called me. I was playing with my son, and he said, "That's it. He's done it. I'm fired. You got it." And I said, "Wait a minute. How, what?" And he said, "He fired me on Twitter." And that
he was not called. He was not called.
He was not called. He learned it. And Chris keeps an eye on Twitter, regardless of what's going on. So I think he did see it himself when it came across. I did not. And I asked him, say, I can go with you. And he said, no, you just stay behind, finish the fight with the team, finish it off, stay and get it done. Roger, we'll talk later. It was probably a 45-second phone call. I then called the chief of staff and said, okay, we need to start putting in place an all hands message to the workforce and figure out what we need to do. In the middle of that call, Acting Secretary Wolf then called me. So I jumped off from our chief,
This is Chad Wolf. Yeah.
Acting Secretary Wolf, yes. And he said, well, I know you've probably heard the news about Chris. I said, I have. Is it me too? And he said, no, they're not asking for your resignation, but they don't want you running CISA. And that's, I'm paraphrasing his sentiment. And
but you were next in line.
There was a succession order that the secretary had signed and even updated a few weeks ago when we added Brandon Wales as number 3. Now, to his credit, he hadn't been consulted on this, so he was kind of caught surprised by the White House's decision on this. And when I told him these would not be, conditions which I could stay, obviously, he said, "Don't do anything. Let me see. I see if I can fix this." And so for about 90 minutes, I stood there while my phones are exploding, and he was working with his White House personnel and others to see if he could get this turned around. And when he called me back, about 9 minutes later, he said he couldn't, and I regretfully told him I have to leave. He understood that, and then that was that. So it was a pretty frenetic Tuesday evening, and it's still experience I've really cherished being the deputy director of CISA and working with Chris, and really, as he's articulated, really proud of what we were able to accomplish.
Were you surprised by this level of politicization of an agency that's just there to give out practical and accurate information?
Kara, I was, there was a surreal nature to it, and seeing just Chris's firing all over the news when we're a component of a department.
Right.
And when my resignation hit the press, I think Don Lemon broke into his broadcast and announced it, and then my name's on the Chiron. And in what bizarre world does the deputy director of a DHS component or into prime time? So it was odd that an agency that was new and relatively unknown getting this kind of attention in a bizarre way. I think it helped our profile because we were trying to let the American people know all that we're doing. And our agency is really entirely based on partnerships. And so we do need people to know the resources that CISA has, the things that we can do to help, and the programs that we offer.
What about the people on the ground there, the people who are working within the agency? It was very dramatic what happened with Chris and you and Brian. But what happened? How do the people within the agency, which is how many people at this point?
About 2,200.
Right, working on all kinds of issues. How are they impacted?
Well, we've enjoyed some real stability for the most part during this administration, which I think was unique in the Trump administration, that you didn't have a lot of turnover. Jeanette Manfred left us at the beginning of the year, but Brian stepped right in. And
they might not have known you were there, but okay, all right.
Yeah, that is true. The workforce, I don't think ever saw this coming. Now, to Chris's credit, I think he was playing in his head how this could unfold in a bad way, which is one of the reasons we wanted to bring Brandon Wales, and we created this executive director position. So there was kind of a quick removal of the political leadership, that it would stop pretty quickly. And Brandon is a tremendous career senior executive. And so that we just did that over the summer. So I think they were very, Brandon's presence stabilized things. My resignation wasn't effective until the end of that week. I actually had to unwind from some things. So I was in the office Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And a lot of people, everyone expected us to leave in January anyway. So in the big picture, it's only about 2 months. But the way it happened, I think, was certainly.
Well, one of the things you tweeted was it must stay nonpartisan, protect that. God gave us a conscience to use it. That was your messaging
that was my farewell message to the staff, to the workforce. I didn't want to use an internal email. And what I meant by that is, I think, Chris and I were of the same mind of this from the get-go, that our mission at CISA is somewhat unique within the department. One, we don't have any law enforcement authority.
Right.
And we're really the only agency that is completely reliant on a partnership model. I had one regulatory authority, which is over the chemical industry. So we regulate security standards for chemical manufacturers and suppliers. Everything else is a voluntary partnership model. So, if you go to the airport and you want to get on a plane, you got to work with TSA, whether you like it or not. You cross the border, you're going to encounter CBP, hurricane your state, you're going to deal with FEMA. No one has to work with CISA. But yet we have a mission to raise the baseline of security across 16 sectors of infrastructure, 50 states and the territories, in addition to the federal civilian executive branch, the .gov. And so we have to make sure that people want to work with us. And if we are starting to, play partisan politics with security, that, first principles of what a government should be doing, protecting those systems, those activities that enable our economy, that provide security, that drive the American way of life, that's what we're protecting at CISA. That is not a political issue. You can have legitimate political differences on a range of issues within the Homeland Security portfolio. Immigration is just one. But I have yet to see a partisan issue within securing America's infrastructure that warrants politicizing what we do. And what we're hearing from the Trump campaign was, in effect, politicizing the security of a subsector of infrastructure, namely the election system. And so that was my message to the workforce: is we've worked hard to establish that bipartisan, or really nonpartisan, reputation. We work closely with a number of governors, from Democrat states and Republican states, Governor Pritzker, Governor Ducey, Governor Lamont, Connecticut, DeWine, a whole bunch of folks governors who really cyber savvy, and if they think that we're playing games with, well, you're a red state, blue state, then we lose our credibility,
and yet here you are. It's only one of the things you do, which is election security, and here you are, and it has become politicized. So let's talk a little bit. Let me go backwards a little bit in terms of that. You didn't think, there's sort of that horror movie idea that the call is coming from inside the White House, actually. But I think one of the unexpected part of the election was that it actually went pretty smoothly. We didn't see major cyber attacks or attempts at foreign interference. They're obviously there all the time. Mr. Krebs at one point called it just another Tuesday on the internet. Why was it? Were we wrong about estimating the seriousness of the foreign threat, or did you, whether it's Russia or China or Iran, were there other things that they were doing, or that we were paying attention this time as opposed to 2016?
So, Kara, I think one of the lessons we learned from 2016 is, you've got the threat landscape, but you also have known vulnerabilities. And so what we really tried to focus on over the past 3 years is trying to shore up those vulnerabilities and working with the thousands of election jurisdictions in this country to offer them and partner with them to ensure that, one, as you've heard Chris say, install paper ballot backups.
Mm-hmm.
I think we had 80% of states in 2016, almost 95% of the vote was backed up by paper ballot last month. And so it's that capacity building of trying to shore up where we know the vulnerabilities, whether it's in the voter registration databases, working with the election vendors with their infrastructure as well, and just working with the campaigns, making sure that their email protections and all the good cyber hygiene that they need to be employing, as well as the political parties. It was a full court press to do all of that. Now, in 2018, in the midterms, we didn't see a lot of activity. As the New York Times and others have reported, there were some proactive measures that this government took in those midterms. And I think that may have had an effect on the 2020 election day. But on election day, without getting into any classified, there were attempts, and we were very proud of the fact that a number of those all the states really batted them down, that they had those protections in place. And one of the things that we did over the last 2 years is to partner with these secretaries of state and election officials to have we call them Einstein monitors on their networks. So we have some intrusion detection visibility into what's trying to hit their networks. And so we were better prepared. I don't want to speculate on why the adversaries maybe didn't do as much.
Were these attempts foreign or domestic?
I won't get into that here. Let's just say there were the intrusion attempts and other types of mischief on election day again, proudly and this was an all team effort, right? So this is kind of the coordinator of all of this. And we certainly have an election team that was out working with folks. When you look at what the FBI did, NSA, all DOD, we had DOD personnel helping us, as well as a whole partners, the EAC, and really the states and localities themselves. So this wasn't
right. And the states have been the states governors, Governor Ducey, Governor Kemp, have all been very adamant that there wasn't election interference happening here or fraud or anything else. It's been an unusual statements by them, given how close they have been to the Trump administration, for example, in those two states at least. Just
as we try to, they call it as they see it, right? So I think we spent all this time and effort, the American people did, with the funds that Congress gave us. Mm-hmm. Congress was extremely supportive of our election security mission. And I think that money was put to good use. So if the president had won, I suspect that Chris would have been paraded down Pennsylvania Avenue. We'd be pointing to him, see, this was a legitimate election. See, this guy is telling it so. But it cuts both ways. And the president didn't win re-election. And so, but the security was what it was.
All right, so let's talk about one of the things that you pushed forward was the rumor control, and not just the foreign interference, but the uses of our own U.S. companies for domestic disinformation is much more complicated. So let's talk about rumor control and why you took it on. Obviously, it's not just incursions, security incursions, abuse of technologies and things like that, but it's actual just words and ways to influence people. Talk a little bit about that, and what role do you see these social media companies having in combating domestic disinformation? They've sort of done a stutter step towards some action, and I think low bar is a word I think of most of the time.
Well, let me go back to when I came into CISA, which was early 2018, mm-hmm. and it was the 2016 election was still fresh in everyone's minds, and right then the the next target was protecting the 2018 midterms.
Mm-hmm.
And I really observed great partnership from the major platforms. We work closely with them, as did other government agencies. And I think they recognized that their systems were used for purposes that maybe they didn't always anticipate vis-a-vis an election. Ultimately, we at DHS don't want to be the arbiters of truth. So it wasn't really for us to say, well, this persona is some guy in St. Petersburg. It's for them to determine what's the violation of their term of service. And there's a whole debate now about Section 230, and that won't get into that because I don't think CISA really has a role in that. We didn't want to take the mantle of having to point out what's fake and what. I think that's a good role for government. But when it came to ground truth about the election infrastructure and how elections are conducted, we felt very confident we could make a statement there, and that was our role, to talk about the confidence in the election and to swat down rumors related to that.
But here is the platforms being used to make people less confident. In fact, to traffic in lies almost continually and exhaustingly. I think there's about 10 up today by the president himself. So how do you, now that you're not in CISA, what is the role of the government in dealing with that? If someone who is the president of the United States is spewing lies on any of these platforms, what is there a role of government to do that, or you just let it happen?
So I am not one that is, small government Republican. So generally my sensibility is not for more regulation. I don't necessarily like the way that the platforms have applied some of the qualifiers to certain comments. I think it is tough. That's a challenge to try to attain consistency in that. Ultimately, and what we try to do this at CISA was to empower the public, to know your sources and to be a more enlightened citizen. I think citizenship should mean
media literacy is what you're talking about.
Exactly. We had a whole campaign last year about pineapple on pizza, which was to educate the American people about how foreign threat actors could take any issue and use it to divide Americans with lies and just sowing up discord. And we used a harmless analogy of some people like pineapple on pizza, some people don't, but we really showed the tradecraft and the tactics and the techniques that Russia would use to try to divide America. And I think the onus is on Americans if you're going to be a consumer of content and media, it's incumbent upon us to know what the sources are. And obviously in this day and age, what seems to be legitimate media often is not, and that's troubling.
All right, but in a lot of ways, I hear that from a lot of people. People should be responsible themselves. This is a quantum level of difference between a billboard or even a TV ad or a newspaper or anything else, because it's being flooded at you and very specifically targeted, and it's really difficult. And the way it's hidden and it's confusing, and it's the mass amount of it. So, say you suddenly became the head of Facebook or Twitter, either one. What would you talked about those designations they put on, which are so confusing. This is disputed. Instead of just saying this is a lie, they don't seem to want to go that far. How far would you go in that regard? Because we are going to have to rely on these private companies owned by people who have no accountability to do something about this.
Yeah, Kara, it's a hard problem. I would still lean my personal views of not letting 100 flowers bloom necessarily, but letting speech prevail, letting enlightened people point out where there are falsehoods and disinformation. I think we need more people in the sensible center to do that, both in government and media and public life. But I'm just generally my inclination is not towards more suppression of speech, even if it's coming not from the government, because if it's not the government, it's not censorship, but even from the platforms themselves. I don't. So
what would you have them? You think what's there is adequate? This is disputed, which is, I don't know what that means. Actually, it's a non-sentence sentence.
Yeah, it doesn't really work for me. I have.
Here you are at CISA putting out, this is the truth, this is the information, which they could easily point to, and saying this is not true. Is that too far? Is that suppression to say this is a lie is not true?
It's a fine line. It's a tough line to figure out where you're going to draw it, right? So we felt comfortable and confident that we could speak with authority on what the facts are in terms of how elections work and what the election jurisdictions do, what the technology does. We never saw ourselves, and I know you're not asking this question, to be, moderating or arbitrating other people's speech online. But it is going to be a problem that is not going to go away, and as we become more and more beholden to online communications, it's going to be an even tougher challenge in the next election.
Yeah, these soft threats versus a hard threat. So can you assess the difference between these soft threats, which I think are much more significant, I do, than the hard threats? Talk about the difference and where we need to go in terms of what we need to focus on.
Yeah, in many ways, stepping back for the election mission, we look really at the three lanes. There's protecting the election infrastructure, working with the voting companies that make the machines. There's working with the candidates and the parties, making sure that their emails are protected so we don't have another hack like the DNC had. And then there's the disinformation piece. It is, a hybrid threat where you have both, foreign actors who are looking to undermine Western democracies. But obviously, as you alluded to, there's voices from within this country that, as we see the continuing polarization, are going to use the same tactics and techniques to do the same thing, which is to sow discord. And I don't have a good answer for that.
And when you think about the threats to the hardened stuff, the machines, there's also been attacks on the Dominion machines. And just today, the head of Dominion wrote a piece about death threats and others. And obviously, Joe DeGenevo, and one of the most unconscionable things I've seen lately, although there's a long list of that, threatened to thought Chris should be executed. Steve Bannon was talking about beheadings and things like that. How do you deal with that when you're in that system? You want to be reasonable, and this is unreasonable, or beyond unreasonable. It's unconscionable is what it is.
Kara, it's egregious. Lots of words for just how absurd and offensive those comments are. I mean, I got to think that violates some type of code of professional conduct for the DC bar, and I hope they I know Chris responded on the Today Show. But, to quote George Costanza, we're trying to live in society here. And I don't know what happened to shame, right? I mean, for Mr. DeGeneva, why is his wife not ashamed of this kind of language?
No.
Ostensibly a one serious person on a national network should, he's a small man with a small mind and a bad mustache. And it's just unfortunate that, attacks on Chris or anyone. Have you felt under threat?
Has that been something? This is an area, as you said, was sort of a not well-known area. You started it 2 years ago in order just to put out basic information and work with all the different players. Have you felt under threat?
I have not. I'm also not in the same public view. The deputy's the one who's kind of running the agency day to day, Chris is the one out leading us, and so he's going to have a different experience. I won't speak for him, but obviously the comments last night are troubling. We certainly never expected CISA, its mission, its people to be under attack like this, and I hope it ends soon. I hope Mr. DeGeneva takes back those words, apologizes, and recognizes that maybe he just the hot lights of the studio got to him.
I doubt it. I'm sorry to say that. I think they double down on these things constantly and get worse, in fact. But when you created this 2 years ago, one of the things was to bring more tech people into government and to work on these things. So these things now tech intersects with everything. Can we talk a little bit about bringing tech into government in a more significant way? I know it's through the Obama administration, through the Bush administration, this has been talked about, but it still seems separate. Do you look at it that way, or do you feel as if the government has more experience and ability to understand that tech should be at the center part of this?
No, there's work to be done, Karen. Let me just qualify that, Chris and I took what the Congress and President Trump gave us and built CISA, but really the credit for creating CISA not only goes to people like Mike McCall from Texas, Claire McCaskill, Senator Ron Johnson, but also the Obama administration who tried to get this started. Suzanne Spalding and her team prior to CISA really started it. But the notion of we don't have enough tech people in government, and obviously we need to get more tech savvy in terms of getting to the cloud, right? So we look at mission protecting the .gov. We got to get away from 101 civilian executive departments and agencies having their own networks and their own servers and get to the cloud. Congress gave us some hiring authorities to bring in talented technology expert, workers at a lower level to pay them more. Because right now, the best coder out of Caltech, she's going to come in as like a GS9 because she doesn't have experience. In the new regime that will be in place next year, we'll be able to pay her more and get her into government quickly. But the other thing I'd say too is we need a tech infusion at the state and local level. When you look at really the problem sets of like ransomware, what I would hear from the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Governors is we really need more IT modernization for our cities and our states. When you look at some of the operating systems, they're still running Windows 7, and that capitalization for tech is not there. We talk about it, the next infrastructure bill, and I'm sure the roads and the bridges and the tunnels need work. But if that doesn't include a technology component for capital reinvestment in the networks and the IT systems of cities and states, then we're going to be missing opportunity. Because
why doesn't it happen from your perspective?
I think generally CIOs and CISOs are not always at their constituencies are not as they've not been around as long as like education, and we're not taking anything away from any of these other important issues. But when you talk about finite budgets and fiscal austerity, this is not going to be at the top of your list. But as you look at where the risk is now shifting, and that's one of the things that system we try to pride ourselves on is really being a risk advisors to America. When you look at what ransomware has done to a number of large cities that affects the school system, affects the healthcare sector, it's not just you can't pay your parking tickets online. It's really taking down real major infrastructure that
is older
daily life. And so if you really look, if we reassess where our risk resides, I think then the case is pretty apparent that more investment needs to go into technology from government.
Yeah. Windows 7 makes me nervous. All right, we're going to get some questions from the audience. I'm going to read them. This is from Mary McGrail. I'm going to try to get to as many. We only have about 8 or 9 more minutes. Based on your experience at CISA, which industries or fields are most targeted and most susceptible to cyber intrusions? For example, we have now seen how vulnerable hospitals are. What about educational institutions? This, of course, matters during COVID and at all times, but especially right now. And let's try to keep these answers quick so I can get to as many as possible.
Sure. Real quick, you've seen a risk shift since the pandemic started, right? So you see the healthcare sector and hospital networks under more attack than we would previously. And before that, obviously the energy sector, financial sector, but those are better funded than some of the other sectors, so they're better protected. I think we're also depends on the threat actor, right? So if you're a ransomware criminal, you're going to go after kind of the weak links, places don't necessarily have modern IT systems or defenses, school systems and places like that. So I think, but if you're looking at nation state actors, they're going to be looking more for stealing intellectual property, privacy data, those kind of things.
Right. Okay. Question for Matt. Are you concerned that Donald Trump and his campaign associates will use the data gathered through Facebook and texting campaigns to continue to target Americans with disinformative information to their advantage?
I've seen no evidence that they are changing course.
Yeah,
so,
that's a big fat yes, I think. Correct?
Yeah, I see no reason to think they were going to stop.
Do you know how, and this is from Eric Geller, the last one, I'm sorry, was from, it was an anonymous attendee, Eric Geller. Do you know how involved Trump personally was in your and Krebs' ouster? Was it all driven by some 20-something in the personnel office? I think they're talking about Mr. McAtee.
I believe that the president was aware of Chris, but I do not believe that the president was aware of me. What they did was they put a piece of paper in front of him that he signed that overruled the succession order. So I don't expect the president to be aware of it.
So you're an I don't know that guy person. Anyway, probably in truth. Are you in favor, this is from Jaspreet Sandhu, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Are you in favor of digital credentials for future elections? By when will national online voting be rolling out? Oh, goodness. That will go.
Online and voting are two words I never like to see together. So no, I'm not in favor of that. It's the integrity of the election system should be paper-based. It works. And there's talk about Bitcoin and other types of, not Bitcoin, but essentially, going to a kind of a, electronic protection. I think that's way off in the future.
Okay, and but you think that is not anytime. The mail-in ballot already upset people more than enough, although unnecessarily. Patrick Gall, no question, just wanted to say that National Technology Security Coalition, a coalition of CISOs across the nation, is grateful to Chris, Matt, and Brian are at hard work, and they did to support the private sector CISOs. While CISA remains in competent hands, we are deeply disappointed with the level of disruption that has been created by the loss of these CISA leaders. Well, that's a very nice thing. Mary McGrail, based on your, this is, she already asked this one. What is next for Matt Travis and Chris Krebs? I think you'll just have to answer for yourself. Will they remain involved in some fashion with CISA? Will you go back in the Biden administration, or what's going to happen also to the agency under Biden? I
was a political appointee, so I'm a private citizen now. I'm kind of assessing what's next for me, taking a little bit of a break. And I think for CISA and the Biden administration, I hope they continue to put it on a growth trajectory. Let me just say that the Congress has been very supportive of CISA, and I think it needs to be a $3 billion agency at a minimum. It's about, right now, President's budget is 1.7, and you look at our expanding mission set. So I hope the Biden administration continues to help CISA grow to reach full operational capability.
Okay, as an anonymous attendee, do you think it's possible for a government agency to combat disinformation that comes from elected officials within the United States, or is it politically sensitive task best left to civil society and social media platforms? If yes, how do we as government respond to foreign amplification of domestically originated disinformation without stepping into the muck? That is what happened. There was a lot of domestic information that then got amplified by foreign players.
Yeah, that just has Orwellian overtones for my liking. I just really don't like it when the government is the arbiter of truth when it comes to just basic speech.
Okay. Calvin Westbrook, we just have 2 or 3 more. Silence in the face of inaccurate, disputed information, which is what Twitter calls it, can be construed as implicitly supporting such information. How should confusion be addressed?
I think I would go back to what I'd said before. I think it's not just one person on these platforms. The rest of us are on there too, and we can counter argue and point out where things are false. I just think it's up to our society to do a better job of policing ourselves.
All right, just 2 more. Nick Schifrin, I'm sorry I can't get to everyone. Even if you can't provide details of Election Day interference, can you describe how significant the attempts were?
No.
Okay, that's easy. Big, small, little. And last one, Maurice Turner. Actually, I'm gonna. I'll do this very quickly. Can state and local election officials keep up with security requirements without consistent federal funding?
No, I think so. I think it needs to be a priority. I know that there has been federal funding from Congress through the Election Assistance Commission and all the services that CISA provides, from vulnerability assessments that we do all free. So I think that model's worked. And listen, it's a national critical function that we're able to conduct elections. So if we're not putting our money there, then the whole thing, there's bigger trouble we're going to have.
Okay, last question. I'm going to read one, but you don't have to answer this. This is from Mombasa, Kenya, from Mahmoud Noor. The trust and confidence in the U.S. election system is very important to the rest of the world. The disinformation really emboldened dictators in Africa and across the world. This is absolutely true. But the last question from an anonymous attendee: who is the biggest threat to the U.S.? That's my final question here.
From a cybersecurity perspective, it's still the big 4: Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. They all have their different kind of focus areas on what they do and why they do it. But it's those 4 from a cybersecurity perspective, and no one else is even close. No one is even close. And domestically? Cyber criminals are both, in terms of the ransomware that comes abroad, and we don't really assess domestic threats from a cyber perspective. It's all ones and zeros. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, Matt, thank you so much. And thank you so much for your service. It's really important that we have these voices of truth. Just accuracy, not just truth. Let's not even use that loaded a word anymore, but accurate information is really valuable to the continued robustness of our democracy. Kara, anyway, thank you so much. All right, thank you very much. And thank you, Aspen and Susan. Thank you for all the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them.
Thanks so much for joining us for the 5th Annual Aspen Cyber Summit. My name is Betsy Cooper, and I'm the director of the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, a Bay Area-based incubator training technologists how to do policy, and I'm very pleased to introduce our next panel. Before we go on, please feel free to check out the full summit agenda and bios of all of our speakers at aspencybersummit.org. I also want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations in such a complicated year. We would also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SICPA NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. Up next, we have a panel examining the threat of ransomware, moderated by Lily Hay Newman, Senior Security Writer for Wired. Lily, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to this panel about ransomware. It's just become unbelievably prominent in 2020. So I'm really thrilled to be talking about it today. And I'm joined by a great set of panelists who I'm excited to hear from. First is Charles Carmichael. He's the Senior Vice President and CTO of FireEye. The next is Ku Boon Hui, a board member at the Cyber Peace Institute and a former president of Interpol. And last but not least, Maria Thompson, who's the Chief Risk Officer for the state of North Carolina. So I think we have really great representation from a bunch of different levels as everyone is trying to grapple, scrambling to deal with this issue and grapple with this issue. So to all of you, welcome. I really want to just ask first, and maybe we can start with Charles and then we'll go around. What is it about 2020 that has caused this sort of flashpoint for ransomware and just so, totally upped the level of intensity to this unbelievable degree amidst a pandemic, amidst everything that's going on this year?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks for having me here. So I'll tell you, ransomware is by far the #1 cybersecurity threat that we're dealing with today. And we anticipate this is going to be, it can continue to be the #1 cybersecurity threat that we deal with over the next few years until something's done about it. If you ask me how bad was the problem last year, I'd say it was terrible. If you ask me how bad the problem is today, I'd say somehow it managed to get worse. And I say that for a few different reasons. First of all, what really changed over the past 12 months or so is how the ransomware operation has changed. So years ago, we used to see threat actors just deploying encryptors across environments. And so victim organizations could recover systems and data if they had decent backups or if they were able to rebuild their environments. And so a lot of times they didn't need to pay. Nowadays, and over the past 12 months or so, we've seen a number of threat actors steal materially sensitive data from victim organizations. And so the extortion demand has become multifaceted. Not only do people pay to get the tools to get their systems back online, but they're paying a threat actor for the promise that they won't publish the data that they've stolen. They're also paying for the instructions for how the threat actor actually broke into the environment. And so if you look at the problem today, most financially motivated criminals are monetizing their intrusions through ransomware and extortion operations. And they're making a lot of money in the process. It's very common for us to see 7 to 8 figure extortion demands. And we see a lot of victim organizations paying, unfortunately. And that's changed significantly over the years. In prior years, we used to see maybe an average of 6-figure extortion demands. Now 7 figures seems to be the new floor for any medium-sized organization that has the ability to pay. So it is by far the biggest problem. And I know we'll talk about it a little bit later on, but if you look at the acute problem of ransomware at healthcare organizations, it doesn't get any worse than that. Well, actually, it could get worse. I hope it doesn't get any worse than that because it is so bad right now, unfortunately.
Yeah, Maria, I think that's a good segue to hear about some of the things you all have been dealing with in North Carolina and how 2020 has been for you.
Sure, thank you, Lily. And I can attest to everything that Charles said. 2019 was a bad year for us at the state. 2020, we have surpassed the numbers of ransomware incidents that we've seen impacting our counties, our cities, our K through 12s, our community colleges. We're seeing them hit hard. We have a reported 16 ransomware incidents that that's been reported to us. Again, there's always that caveat that's been reported to us that we've actually engaged with these entities to help them. We're talking about counties, again, cities, community colleges. We've had 5 K through 12s that's been impacted. So as you think about all this remote work that we're dealing with this pandemic, the impact to these schools when they have to now figure out how can they produce, training for these kids, these K through 12 students, while dealing to recover with the environment. And as Charles mentioned, we have seen also an increase in exfiltration. And so from a state perspective, we have resources that we bring there to help these entities that are impacted has been really crucial in ensuring that we have some stability moving forward. But yes, it is definitely getting worse for us. And, we are doing what we can to educate all these entities across the state on what actions to take, what are the resources that are available to them, and steps that they should do, and absolutely not pay the ransomware, which I'm sure we'll cover later on.
Right. Yeah. And, I think it's great to be able to talk about response and incident reaction at sort of all these different levels, the state perspective. Kubun, I'm curious about also, what you're hearing internationally, sort of the international law enforcement perspective. What has 2020 signified in the ransomware space?
Yes, thank you. Well, I looked at some Interpol figures arising from COVID-19, and surprisingly, from the police perspective, I think they did surveys of police forces. Ransomware is number 2. It's not number 1. Number 1 remains phishing and scams and frauds. I guess it's the number of people who are reporting, because the others affect individuals, whereas ransomware affect companies and not all of them report. But I have no doubt that ransomware is a huge thing, because I think criminals have now been disrupted from their usual crimes owing to stricter border controls and restricted movements during lockdowns. And of course, there's less economic activity. So they are looking for alternative revenue streams. I think, as Charles has mentioned, it's very profitable. And now we've got cybercrime or malware as a service. So this gives easy entry for other criminal groups who been derived of their normal stream of incomes, have now ventured into this enterprise. And there's also easy entry into darknet markets. And we know that the reach is global, because attacks are not geographically limited. The same group may attack a country like Japan or Middle East, or even the US. They don't discriminate. And of course, you've mentioned that targets have changed from individuals to businesses, governments, and critical infrastructure, because there's more to lose and people are more willing to pay because of the crisis situation. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe just to add on to what you just mentioned. We've seen a number of threat actors shift their operations in terms of how they're monetizing their intrusions to focus on ransomware. And to give you an example, there's a group that we track, we call them Fin6. Fin6 is a highly notorious threat actor that was responsible for a lot of credit card theft at a lot of very large global merchants over the years. And historically, we exclusively saw them steal credit card information from victim organizations. And nowadays, we sometimes see them steal credit card data. But if you think about how you monetize the theft of credit card information, you've got to steal credit card information. You've got to wait long enough to get enough unique cards. And then you've got to sell it somewhere. And you usually sell it for a few dollars, but you make your money when you sell it in bulk. And you think about a ransomware operation, which may take a few days and may net you, 10x what you would have otherwise been able to make through a credit card theft operation. And so now we see Fin6 mostly focus on deploying ransomware. We're starting to see Fin7 start to deploy ransomware. And so we see a lot of new actors deploying ransomware, we see a lot of older actors that have historically focused on something else now shift over to this multifaceted extortion demand.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, that not only are actors shifting to ransomware, but as a number of you were detailing before, there's also this sort of layered extortion that's going on. It's not simply ransomware, there's also the data extortion, and as many elements as can be crammed in there to up the urgency to motivate a payment. So the payment question is the big one. And I'd like to talk quite a bit about, different ways that the global community can react to this. But, Maria, you were talking about don't pay, right? Encouraging victims not to pay. Just what is the practicality of that? And can you talk a little bit about how, my understanding is there are sort of numerous benefits to, if you possibly can, refusing to pay and trying to remediate and rebuild a different way. Why is that your recommendation?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very tough decision to make. And when you tell an entity that's down, when you tell a county that has all these services that they're providing to their citizens, whether it's for child support services or even critical infrastructure, we're talking about criminal justice systems that are being impacted, 911 systems that are being impacted whenever there's a ransomware. So when you tell an organization don't pay, there's always that pause, that pregnant pause. It's like, well, what can what services can you provide? And that's one of the things that, from a state perspective, we have been very strong at, as far as encouraging these entities, that the reason why we're saying not to pay, it's because we have services that we can provide. We have a partnership with our National Guard cyber team. We have partnerships with local IT teams called strike teams. And these are individuals that, as soon as we hear that there is a ransomware incident that's ongoing, we have a scoping call. We'll launch boots on the ground out there to help them, to guide them, to remediate, to recover, to do the forensics on their environment, to get them back up faster. So we're not just saying don't pay and leaving them to figure out how they can recover. We're saying don't pay, here's how we're going to help you. And we're going to give you a strategy on how you can recover and rebuild your environment in a more secure manner. Because what we've seen is entities that have been impacted, there is a rush to bring the environment back up, which usually ends up with reinfection within a month or so, sometimes even earlier than that. So again, having a methodical approach on how to recover that environment is key. But then look at, why are you paying that ransom? I have to tell you, this has been something that has been a pain point for me. We've seen most recently this year that some of the entities that have cyber insurance, they're being, I would say, not highly encouraged to pay the ransom by these entities that that they're working with their insurance carriers, which is something that really runs counter to what we're saying right now, because obviously there's a vicious cycle. We keep paying, they keep deploying the ransomware. If we keep monetizing this situation, it will never go away. So we have to take a strong approach and not pay the ransom.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I agree with what Maria said, but the counterpoint here is, well, I'll start by saying I've had an evolving position on whether or not you even engage with a threat actor and have a conversation with them, or even whether or not you decide to pay. And I don't encourage my clients to either pay or not pay, but I do encourage them to have a thoughtful conversation about what are the pros and what are the cons of paying. And so I'd love to share some of the considerations and some of the actual learnings here. So from a considerations perspective, I think Maria brought up a really good point around emergency services. So some cities think about, what is the impact? What's the business impact? What's the human life impact? And think about cities that are impacted. If people can't dial 911 and get police officers or fire departments or ambulances there, people could potentially die. And so you got to think about, what's the actual impact of having systems taken offline. You got to think about, what's the ability to recover on your own through backups or other business resiliency capabilities. And I'll tell you, by the way, a lot of times people get criticized for not having good backups. But I'll tell you, a lot of times victims actually have pretty good backups, but the attackers either destroyed the backups or the backup infrastructure is so taxed because every single server and every single workstation in the environment was taken offline in a matter of hours, that you can't possibly recover 40,000 systems with the existing backup infrastructure. It just takes weeks or months. It's just so taxed. And so we find out some victims choose to pay because they want to accelerate the process of bringing their network online. There's various reasons why people choose to pay. And I'm not saying you should pay or you shouldn't, but I do, again, I do encourage organizations to have a very thoughtful process and make the decision based on, a number of considerations. Other things to consider are, and some of these things may sound silly, but how reliable is the threat actor? And I know that sounds silly, but there are certain threat actors that have proven to be more reliable than others. Some are highly unreliable, so you would never consider paying them. But some have had a history of being reliable. And because of that historical reliability, that gives you some level of confidence that if you pay somebody $1 million, and by the way, again, as I mentioned, the average amount of money that people are asking for right now is in the millions. Sometimes I've seen payments between $10 and $30 million over the past 6 months. If you're going to give somebody $10 million, you want some kind of confidence and assurances that they're going to give you something that works. And so, there are security companies that track the reliability of threat actors in terms of, do they give working tools when they're paid? And if they don't have a good reliability score, they're not going to get paid. So their business model depends on it. But let me talk about, the learnings. What I find is most of the times when threat actors are paid, they technically have the ability to come back into the environment and re-extort the entity by redeploying encryptors or stealing new data. But for the most part, most of these threat actors choose to move on and just hit the next victim. And that's because they have such broad access to so many environments today that they don't have to re-extort the same entity multiple times. They could just hit the next entity. At some point in time, I know that's going to change. We're going to get a re-extortion by the same threat actor because maybe they just want more money, or the people that are members of the group get in a fight with each other, or maybe there's miscommunication. So it's inevitably going to happen. By the way, I've absolutely seen victims being hit by multiple distinct threat actors 6 months apart from each other. And they assumed that they were related incidents, and they weren't many of those times. Sometimes they could be, but many of the times they're not. And I'll tell you, before 2016, most of the threat actors that I saw that stole data, that asked for money in exchange for a promise to delete the data and not publish it online, the majority of those incidents, we saw the threat actors re-extort the entity or dump the data online at some later point in time. It's usually a year later or multiple years later. So I do anticipate at some point in time, we're going to start seeing the dump and release of a lot of the data that unfortunately has been stolen now, and that where the threat actors have been paid not to publish data. I find it sometimes funny. Certain threat actors will send a certificate of destruction promising that they've deleted data, or they'll share a video that shows them deleting the data. And yes, it shows a video of them deleting some data. Doesn't mean it's everything. Doesn't mean they don't have a copy of it. So yeah, the one assurance, not assurance is probably the wrong word, but the one thing I do realize is it's hard for attackers to maintain terabytes upon terabytes of data for so long. So it's probable that some of them are deleting some of the data that they stole.
That's an interesting point. Kuboon, I'm curious about your thoughts on to pay or not to pay, because I feel like Maria and Charles really laid out why our ideals, or what law enforcement and others are suggesting, meaning why don't pay is so difficult in practice. And there's just so much nuance here. It would be, I think victims would appreciate if it was clear cut, just pay or don't pay, or do or don't do. And I like what Maria was saying about we're going to say don't pay, but we're going to provide resources so you're not out on your own, and there's support to go that path. But I'm curious what your take on all of this is.
Yes, thank you. No, I think I go along with Charles, though my instinct as a former police officer is don't pay, because from the physical world, the physical equivalent, when you get kidnapping for ransom, you negotiate, you ask for proof of life, and then you pay, but you actually follow the money. But I think in the cyber world, you can't follow the money so easily. So I can understand why people pay, because even police departments have paid, right? But I think what's important is you need to negotiate, get in contact with the attacker, because then you buy time. You want to find out how deep he is in your network and whether he can repeat the attack or he's left something behind. And then you negotiate for a lower fee. It's actually to buy time. Of course, if you pay them, then they'll develop more tools. And I think in today's world, they can be as good as state-related threat actors in that they can infiltrate, stay in your network for a long time, look for all your crown jewels, and perhaps even figure out how much is your pain point, how much are you willing to pay. So they're getting more and more sophisticated because of the amount of money that they're getting. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and I'll say, look, nobody wants to pay threat actors. Nobody takes it lightly. Some people feel so coerced into doing it that they have no better choice. And one thing that that's really changed over the past 12 months is how threat actors are amplifying their attacks now. So years ago, what they would do is literally they reach out to people like you, maybe not you specifically, but other journalists out there, and they'd say, "Hey, we've hacked into company X. We've deployed ransomware, or we've stolen data from this victim organization, and will you write a story about it?" And some journalists would, some wouldn't. And now what's really changed is the threat actors have taken it into their own hands, and they've created these naming and shaming websites. So when they break into a company and they steal data from those organizations, they give the victim maybe 5 days or 7 days or some period of time before they publish information about the victim. And many times they'll say they've hacked into company X and they've got 7 days to pay. Otherwise, they're going to publish the data that was actually stolen. And it's interesting to see how that sometimes coerces people to pay. Sometimes it actually guarantees that a victim won't pay, because people know when you show up on a shaming site and then you disappear from the shaming site, the assumption is that you've paid, and nobody likes anybody to know that a threat actor has been paid. But the key point is the threat actor is trying to amplify their hack by posting information on these shaming sites, and they understand that journalists will, they monitor that. They'll amplify the story. Maybe not obviously not intentional to support the threat actor, but ultimately does end up supporting the threat actor in the process.
So Charles, I'd like to just follow up with what you just said. And I think one of the key things, we've touched on is the fact that your data is already compromised. Your network is already compromised. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the whole conversation. Your data, regardless of whether someone is telling you that we won't publish your data, you should already consider it as gone. And I think that in the heat of the moment, that is lost in some of the folks that are impacted. And so they do that knee-jerk reaction to, I do want to minimize my reputational damage. I do want to minimize, potential loss of business because of, the downtime, and they make these decisions. And it is a very tough decision, especially if you're a global entity or even a state entity that has, a lot of constituents that they have to support. But I still firmly believe that we have to continue to take a hardline approach so that this stops. They will shift their target and they'll shift their business model. But, I think that if we continue to fall victim to this, then we're just going to keep, perpetuating the cycle.
Yeah, I agree. Paying the threat actors absolutely perpetuates the problem. The challenge that we have is there's so many victims that feel no better option, but they pay. And so because so many people are paying, it's just going to continue until something very dramatic happens. And I know we'll spend a bit of time talking about what are potential ways in which we could mitigate the risk of ransomware and the extortion around it. But yeah, it's to me, I feel like it is the #1 cybersecurity problem out there, just because of the prevalence and the impact to organizations and to the people.
And Lily, I think I remember you writing in Wired about the Westermo case, the Finnish healthcare and mental health service provider. I think they had a few breaches and there was a ransom demand to keep their stolen data out of the public domain. and then after that, they attacked the patients and asked for money as well, which really was insidious.
Yeah.
And of course, you get complaints from your patients, your reputation falls to bits. I think the managing director was sacked. Yeah, terrible.
Right. And that was a mental health services group, therapy notes, really private stuff. There's so many different types of private data, but that was a type that felt very invasive. So I am glad you brought up that example. In the Q&A, a lot of people are asking about, and I think it's a good time to talk about this, the motivation of these actors, and maybe we can talk, Charles has brought up some specifics, but maybe we can talk specifically about some of the groups. People are asking about, right, this shift that's happening in 2020 from just, okay, people are, criminals are trying to make money and we get that as a motivation, to just such an extreme level of disruption, targeting healthcare, as we were mentioning, during an incredibly just morally black moment to target healthcare in particular. Not that it's ever acceptable, but during a pandemic. And also this year, we've seen actors move more firmly into targeting industrial control systems like energy sector, gas, electric, those types of things. The ransomware Ekans, I remember, specifically designed with components to shut down ICS specific systems and services. So I'm just wondering about, and people in the Q&A are asking as well, we still hear that this is all financially motivated and it's really being driven by criminal innovation, and all of you have been giving examples of the criminal innovation and transitions from one type of criminal action to ransomware in 2020. But can one of you, or all of you, chime in on why is it moving in such a dark direction? Is this where they need to go to just make as much money as they want to make? Or, how can it be that we're getting to such a dire and extreme point with this, all for criminals to just make some cash?
Yeah, so I've got a few thoughts on that, Lily. First of all, let's talk about the healthcare hacking. Not every threat actor is willing to cross the line to hit hospitals. And in fact, many ransomware groups have publicly stated they're not going to hit healthcare organizations, specifically hospitals, given the global pandemic that's going on right now. And we've actually seen many threat actors explicitly ignore or exclude hospitals from their targeting. Sometimes we see certain threat actors end up gaining access to hospitals and then deploying encryptors, and then later realizing that they've actually hit a hospital. And I've seen these communications between the victims and the threat actors where it is very clear to me the threat actors didn't realize they hit a hospital. And you might ask, well, how do you know? How is it possible they didn't know they hit a hospital? So a lot of hospitals are associated with universities. And so sometimes we believe the threat actor thought they hit a university or another research institution, which, by the way, to them is fair game from a hacking perspective. And so they've chosen not to hit hospitals. Whereas we've seen some specific groups deliberately focus on hospital organizations. And they did that largely for financial reasons, because they felt that hospitals feel compelled to pay, and they pay quickly and they pay a lot of money. And so that's why we saw about a month ago a very acute targeting of hospital organizations by a very specific Eastern European criminal group. And many folks in government and Mandiant and Microsoft and others raised the alarm because we were so concerned about the sheer volume of hospitals that were being hacked and just the overall impact to that. In terms of what's the motivation, I'll tell you from my organic firsthand observation, and we've worked with over 1,000 organizations dealing with this, it largely seems focused on financially motivated reasons. So most of the criminals that we see are doing this because they want money. With that said, we certainly have plenty of examples where we believe nation states have deployed a ransomware And they've done it in such a way where they weren't financially motivated, but they were looking to obscure the attack and maybe throw a false flag and make it look like somebody else was doing it. Because most people would reasonably assume that a nation state operator doesn't need to ask for $1 million because they're a government. They have billions or trillions of dollars. And so we've seen that. I anticipate we will see that more in the future, where state-sponsored operators deploy ransomware as maybe a final part of their intrusion after they've already done what they actually intended to do, to make it look like this was a financially motivated operation. So we're not seeing a whole lot of that yet, but I do anticipate we will start to see more of that in the coming years.
And following on to what Charles mentioned, from a state and local government perspective, we have not seen or received any indication of any kind of nation state type attacks against us. It's been generally what we call the spray and pray method, where they're looking at low hanging fruit. And I hate to say it, but local government, sometimes we appear to be low hanging fruit because of the lack of resources that we can bring to bring to bear to protect the network, so on and so forth, or the lack of cyber hygiene. One of the things that we all hate to do, but it really makes a difference if we do it well and make ourselves a hardened target. So that's the initiatives that we're working on in the state is how can we strengthen our security posture across the board. And we're doing this by going out to these entities, doing proactive assessments on their environment, giving them a structured way of identifying what their remediation processes will be so that they make themselves as hard as possible, educating also the IT staff members that are there. But yeah, it's definitely not, because we all know that if there's a nation state out there and they're trying to get you, it's going to be hard. They'll probably succeed. That's just the way that it is. But it's been the spray and pray that we've been seeing at state and local.
Yeah, maybe I'll just chime in here. I've been a victim of a nation state attack. I'm actually also on the board of a public health service, healthcare service. In fact, it's the largest public healthcare service in Singapore. We cover half of the nation's hospitals. And we were subject to an attack from 2017 with data exfiltrated in 2018. This was before COVID. 1.5 million patients' data were taken, but more importantly, among the group of VIPs, our Prime Minister's data, thankfully not the diagnosis and all that, just his prescriptions, and mine included also, have been taken. And we presume that it's for intelligence purposes, but I'm sure today these things will carry on. And as Charles pointed out, they could be disguised as ransomware attacks because the tools are basically the same. Yeah, so very tough.
And I'm curious also, Kubu, your thoughts about, maybe we can move into talking a bit about, what can be done to change this. And I'm curious about your thoughts on international norms, law enforcement in this regard, if this is nation state activity or if that, continues to rise in the future as it relates to ransomware. How do we establish acceptable behavior, for something like that, especially when there can be potential, industrial control services, loss of life, critical, infrastructure impact. But if it's all criminal, if it's criminally motivated, still, what are the standards and expectations globally about how we're going to deal with this? Because, as horrendous as scamming and sort of theft of money is, this is even worse because it's starting to tip into these other, areas.
Yes, I think there are quite a few nations who are concerned about this, concerned enough to sponsor things that are going on in the UN. I think you all are aware that we've had groups of government experts meeting, and everyone is waiting for the results of the latest one, and together with the open-ended working group. I think there are already agreed norms by all nations from the 2015 Group of Government Experts report. Some of these norms of behavior expected of states, there are limiting norms, like states should not knowingly allow their territory to be used for internationally wrongful acts using ICTs. States should not conduct or knowingly support ICT activity that intentionally damages critical infrastructure. States should cooperate to increase stability and security in the use of ICTs and to prevent harmful practices. States should consider how best to cooperate, to exchange information, to assist each other, and to prosecute terrorists and criminal use of ICTs. States should respond to appropriate requests for assistance by other states whose critical infrastructure is subject to malicious ICT acts. Well, these are all accepted, but unfortunately, who is watching, who follows the norms? I think that is the dilemma, and it speaks to the diplomatically sensitive issues that are the reality today. So I'm still hopeful that things will work out at the UN because the two chairs of the two groups have been meeting. One is a multi-stakeholder one, and one is a group that just consists of government experts. And that's why I joined the Cyber Peace Institute, because we are committed to helping the common man as well as trying to deal with some of these issues. As some of you who go through our website will know, we try this through assistance to increase the civilians' digital resilience and provide assistance in their response and recovery after cyber attacks. Accountability, to close the accountability gap through collaborative analysis of cyber attacks, and advancement of international law and norms in order to promote responsible behavior in cyberspace. So a bit of advertisement. We did sign, I think some of us signed something to say that please do not attack healthcare, and we got some renowned people to do it. Also, we started this Cyber for Healthcare, where 4 is a 4. And we try to do things like matching volunteers to people in need, and we do it in a way which will provide free services. And we've done labs to help people as well. I think on the other hand, Interpol is trying to also get the police around the world to collaborate, to work with the cybersecurity company, because we know private has a lot of information, and to do capacity building as well as to call out threats. Yeah, but not easy to get the criminals. Even if you indict them, you might not be able to get them out of the country, but at least you can disrupt their activities. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, and some folks in the Q&A are asking about, policy, building on what you were talking about, and particularly, how do you disrupt the business model? And I'm wondering, Charles or Maria, if you have thoughts about that. What are some, it's just such a brutal barrage right now. What are some brute force instruments that defenders have in their pocket?
Maria, do you want to go first?
Sure. From a defender standpoint, well, let's start with the high level, the administrative piece of it. We are within the state of North Carolina. We are working on legislation right now. We're hoping to propose with the next session to ensure that local or government entities do not pay the ransomware. So we're hoping that that passes, that we'll have some legislation that prohibits the use of or the paying of ransomware. But it's really, and I hate to, well, I'm going to use this saying, it warms the cockles of my heart when hearing from a global front that there's a lot of collaboration that's going on, because I think that that's key. Within North Carolina, we had to last year enact legislation to facilitate the sharing of information between the local government, because they've in the past operated independently of the state agencies, but now we're sharing and collaborating a lot more. And I think that will help us understand the breadth and the issues that we're dealing with, from a statewide perspective. We have 100 counties within the state of North Carolina, 532 municipals. So it's huge, and we have to figure out how we can secure the infrastructure. From a tools and techniques perspective, I mentioned before the National Guard, there are cyber teams that are out there, cyber response forces, partnering with our local IT folks that are there. And we're also putting tools and capabilities on the infrastructure to help to reduce the attacks that are coming at these entities. So something that's more proactive, not another tool that's alerting and only causing more noise for these entities that are under-resourced. So there's tools out there, and we're also looking at a whole of state approach to cybersecurity, which includes continuous monitoring the networks, making sure there's another eyes on glass, making sure that there's something that's proactively blocking and alerting. So between the information sharing and the tools, we are circling the wagon on that.
Charles, do you have any last thoughts on that? We're getting to the end of our time about, how to kind of crack this nut.
Yeah, absolutely. So just a few thoughts. One, because at Mandiant we see so much ransomware all the time, we decided, hey, we're going to document what our playbook is when we get engaged by organizations and just get that out there. So we produced a 24-page document, step-by-step instructions for organizations to use in the event that they get hit with ransomware. But ideally, in preparation for a ransomware attack, it's just really good technical steps to mitigate the risk of it. But beyond that, as I think about what government can do or what the community can do, there's a few things that I think will really help. I don't think there's a magic answer that solves everything, but I do want to share a few learnings. One, I see law enforcement and other companies out there doing a pretty good job of notifying victims that they have an attacker in the environment, and giving them enough time to eradicate the attacker before they have the ability to either steal data or deploy encryptors across the environment. So I'd love to see law enforcement and commercial entities continuing to do that. Two, the sanctions process actually works. It works in varying ways, but to give you one example, there are two individuals out of Iran that were behind the SamSam operation. After the indictment, of those individuals, we didn't see any further intrusions by that threat actor. And so that was the indictment. From a sanctions perspective, the folks behind Evil Corp or the Drydex operation, because they've been sanctioned and because there's belief that they are tied to the Wastelocker ransomware operation, we see very few victims paying the threat actor because of fear of violating sanctions. And so I do understand there's a double-edged sword with respect to sanctions. It helps, it hurts, it creates a lot of confusion for victim organizations that are already in a really tough position. But I do know that it helps a little bit, and I know the intention is positive. Obviously, the arrests, anytime a threat actor could get identified and arrested, it's always a good thing. And you know that when some of these individuals that come into a pretty substantial wealth over a short period of time, they want to travel, they want to enjoy the money, and they can be picked up when they leave their countries and travel to a place that have extradition laws with the United States. And then the last thing I'd say is, to the extent the government can disrupt some of the infrastructure that the attackers are using and make more pain for the threat actor, cost them more money, it may mitigate some of the risk. Now, granted, there could certainly be recourse from that. People could get upset because it might cost more money for them. They may ask for more in ransom and extortion demands. But I'd love to see more actions being taken to try to curb this. And I do think it's going to continue to be a pretty big problem unless something drastic happens.
Yeah, it's such a tough issue. We could be talking about it for hours, and you've all been so great. Maria, Kubun, and Charles, thank you so much for being here, and thanks to Aspen, and thanks everyone for your great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them, but we tried to do a sort of speedy address of as many of these issues as possible. Like Charles was saying, this is just such a crucial issue in 2020 and going into 2021. So thank you all, and enjoy the next panel.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the 5th Annual Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm Vivian Schiller, the Director of Aspen Digital, and I am pleased to introduce our next panel. As a reminder, the full summit agenda and bios of all our speakers are available at aspencybersummit.org. And if you plan to tweet, and we encourage you to, please use the hashtag AspenCyber. I want to thank FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this week's summit possible and helping us convene this important set of conversations and to understand such a complicated year. We also want to acknowledge Blue Vector, SIGPA-NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. Up next, we have a conversation with Nick Thompson, the editor-in-chief of Wired, and Cloudflare COO and co-founder Michelle Zatlin, who is also a member of Aspen Cybersecurity Group. Over to you, Nick.
All right. Thank you, Vivian. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for hosting this awesome event. I am blown away by all the other folks doing all the other panels, and this should be great. So, as noted, I'm with Michelle Zatlin, the co-founder and COO of Cloudflare. We used to describe Cloudflare as the most important company you've not heard of, but now, actually, after the last 2 years, everybody has heard of it. So Michelle is all over it. Good afternoon, Michelle. How are you?
I'm great. Hi. Well, I'm in California, so it's still the morning for me. I've just finished my coffee. But good morning to those on the East Coast, and good morning to those on the West Coast, and good evening if you're in Europe. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really grateful to be here, and I will admit that I kind of wish we were in Aspen right now. That sounds pretty nice. As much as I like where I live, I miss traveling just a little bit.
I know traveling to Aspen was actually, of all the things that the trips that the pandemic cut short, Aspen is kind of the one that I miss the most. All right, well, let's get cracking. So this pandemic happened.
Yes.
You at Cloudflare are in the rare position where you get to actually watch the entire internet. So you've seen this crazy transformation as the world that used to happen IRL has now moved online. Tell me the weirdest, most surprising thing you've learned about how humans have used the internet since March 2020.
That we have all become better digital citizens. Everybody has gone online. We really have. I mean, what happened in March is very quickly, the pandemic kind of raised its level of severity so quickly, basically overnight. And I'm within a 2-week period, the amount of traffic online doubled around the world. This was not unique to the United States or Canada or UK. It was literally globally. So almost every country around the world saw a doubling of an increase of online traffic overnight. And so I say that because it's pretty remarkable for 2 reasons. First, that all of a sudden all these people who were doing things in real life went online to start to do it. And I really think that there were a lot of parents out there who said, I would never do online lessons for my kids. And next thing you know, they're doing online music lessons, and now it's really normal. It's actually almost even better not to go to the musicians, the music teacher's house. I can do it online or school online. But it's not just parents, it's older parents, Zoom calls, it's younger kids getting online. I mean, I look at my kids and it's kind of sad, but their digital skills surpass my 7-year-old can use the iPad scaringly too much. So also online. But the second thing that's been really interesting, because I bring this up is, and we're an infrastructure provider, so it's kind of my role to bring it up, is it's amazing that the internet held together as well as it did. I mean, do you think about it overnight, a doubling of traffic, which was, no one was expecting that. And by no one, I mean none of the cloud providers that really make this run behind the scenes were expecting that. And so it's pretty amazing it held together as well as it did. So I think those are 2, maybe in retrospect, not so obvious, but interesting kind of points that we've seen of just traffic way up around the world. And since then it's ebbed and flowed as restrictions have been lifted, but internet traffic is way up, and people are doing a lot more online. They're communicating, they're commercing, they're doing a lot more online than they were, doing a lot more business online. They're working in different ways online. They're being productive in different ways, using different tools than they were just in February of this year.
Well, I have one strong objection to what you said.
Okay, good.
Online music classes versus in-home. As a father of someone who has a son who practices the trombone right next to the home office, there's been some complexities in that particular dynamic, as much as I love having him there playing the bone. But it might start up again soon, as you all will hear. Let me ask you why the internet held together. So one hypothesis is there was this massive increase in traffic, but it was easier to handle than you might have thought because we're all at home. So it's just through Wi-Fi. So it's through these thick pipes, right? You know, all these Zooms are going on in my house, but it's all through a big fat Wi-Fi connection. We're not, you know, going tower to tower and there's not a handoff in the car. Is that part of the explanation, or why else has the internet not collapsed?
I mean, again, the true heroes of this pandemic, as we look back, are going to be the medical responders. I mean, what they've had to endure. I think we're all very grateful for their service. But I mean, maybe the faithful sidekick were a lot of the cloud-based companies that held together. I mean, whether you're as a person connecting through my Wi-Fi or cell tower is one thing, but there's somebody behind the scenes who has to make that connection happen, right? And doubling the traffic overnight is a big deal for all those companies who have to hold it together, including ours. And so all of the large global cloud providers, I mean, that's Amazon, like AWS, that's Google Cloud, it's Microsoft Azure, it's IBM, so it's Ali Cloud out of China, saw huge surges in traffic. And the fact that it kind of happened without a blip was quite, I think, remarkable. Network providers like Cloudflare, traffic way up, we were holding together. But behind the scenes, although it worked, that took a lot of people and technology to make sure that the internet kept running. And so there was a lot of network engineers, a lot of network administrators that were sweating the details for all of us to make it seamless for the end digital citizen like yourself. And so the network administrators who are making these cloud providers run globally kind of deserve some gold stars for holding the internet together during that huge spike in traffic.
Props to all the network engineers, except for the ones at the Delhi telephone company who cut me off right before I was about to give a talk to 1,000 people in about May. But we'll let them be. Tell me about something that some service or some system that has moved into the cloud much more quickly than you would have thought. Like, so for example, one thing that I've been interested in is how much of financial exchanges have moved into the cloud, right? And you know, they've always been a mix of on-prem and cloud, but it seems like they're all going to be entirely cloud fairly soon, which is pretty different. What is something else where the move into the cloud has been interesting or surprising?
Yeah, I mean, I have so many examples. So let me start with some obvious ones that'll make me move up to some not obvious, because I think this is really interesting. So we'll start with a small business owner, okay? Yoga teacher used to do all their yoga classes in person. All of a sudden, the studio closed. Yoga teachers don't have big margins, right? They're kind of living almost paycheck to paycheck. And so a lot of them pivoted, or some really pivoted to online classes and using online video streaming. We have something called Stream, but there's other providers out there where they're doing digital online video classes, and where now you're not just connecting with your community, you can build an audience globally, and it's all digitally online first. So it's kind of this digital first strategy. So that's one example. A second example is a very well-known consumer company. They are a consumer foods company, kind of a rising star, I would say, and they supply a lot of their product to restaurants. Well, restaurants have had a hard time during this because especially in the early days, we couldn't go and support them. And so they very quickly pivoted to a direct-to-consumer brand. That was not even in their plans. And so they went from March thinking that they were selling to their supply chain to restaurants to being like, oh my goodness, restaurants are cutting all their orders. We got to stay in business. So they pivoted to building a digital direct-to-consumer brand for their particular product. And they're selling directly to customers, their food item. Which, if you think about that, it's pretty amazing that this business was able to pivot and kind of change, take something that wasn't even a strategy and create a strategy and make it happen. And what I think is pretty incredible is how quickly they could spin it up. And they did not build all the technology themselves. They had the great product, but they used services like Cloudflare and others to build the storefront and get their connected to their audience and start to sell direct to consumer. So that's the second example. Third example is something like DoorDash or any of the meal delivery companies. DoorDash about to go public. There was a great article a few months ago about this. So this public information where, like, again, in March, like everybody in DoorDash was uploading restaurant menus online to help these restaurants become digital first strategies. And it wasn't the restaurant doing it. Some of them were, but it was like almost like DoorDash were like, okay, we're going to help you. And they've seen something like an 700% increase in the amount of demand. And it's one of these ideas, we all have to eat. we can't go to the restaurant, but hey, can we support them? Can we help do it? And the technology through a company like DoorDash helping make it easy to order, identify what we can make, and then getting it delivered to us is pretty impressive. So I love that story because I just think it's kind of like us all banding together to help make these digital first strategies come to life, and not making it one by one, but doing it in mass. So I think that's really interesting. So those are those. And then there's the large established organizations that you kind of think of as slow, stodgy, last to move, where we've definitely had the CIOs, the CISO say, all of a sudden, my digital transformation, my digital first project that I thought was going to happen 2 years from now has been pulled up by 2 years. We're doing it now. And it's in this case, at this particular company, it was like an oil and gas company where they found all their employees at home. And it was one of these things, they'd spent so much time securing their corporate network. And they were like, our corporate network is rock solid. And all of a sudden their employees were at home. And it just by nature, our home networks aren't as solid as our corporate networks because we haven't invested as much as securing them. And not only that, they've got 3 unissued personal devices connecting, to their work things too. And so a lot of these large industrial companies have said, wow, I got to front load. I have to make it easier to kind of get my next generation user-centric VPN approach together because the old model is not working. And so there's just been a huge shift for things that have worked for the last 10 years. There's been a lot of hardware boxes that have held the internet together to make it work. And what's really interesting, the next 10 years is all about these cloud services that are going to make the internet work. And it's really just accelerated the trend. I saw Harley Finkelstein from Shopify, it's just Black Friday, Cyber Monday. So Shopify was all over that. And, he said something on his Twitter yesterday and said 2013 has arrived here now in 2020. And there's some truth to that. It's like where we thought we were going to be 5 or 10 years from now, it's happening now. And a lot of these transformations are happening faster. And this idea of like, oh, these businesses are slow to pivot. Actually, the best businesses have pivoted very quickly.
Well, let's talk about cybersecurity, because if you had asked me in March or April what I expected would happen, I would have predicted a boom in online education. I would have predicted a boom in healthcare, and I also would have predicted massive hacking, right? For just the reasons you described, right? I'm outside of the Condé Nast building. Not only am I outside of the Condé Nast building, but my kids are using my phone and clicking on every Russian link they see, right? And so how have we not had a massive hacking catastrophe yet? Is that A, because things happen that I wouldn't have predicted that have kept us safe, or B, because it's going to happen tomorrow and the bad guys have just been laying the traps and waiting to, crack the distributed network that we've all created?
So I think that there's a couple pieces to your question that I think it's important to spend some time on, and I'll answer your what you asked at the very end. But I think there's a couple prefaces, especially because there was a ransomware panel right before us, which we didn't get to hear all of it. So there are an increase in attacks online. Now, that's great that you haven't seen and you have been the target of it. So be thankful. But like there are a lot of businesses who have been the target of it. And so we did, Forrester did a study. We worked with them to do a study. And since the pandemic, we surveyed 300 companies around the world, global. 58% of them had dealt with a data breach since the pandemic started. 58%, that's a lot. That's a high percentage. Now, I don't think they're high profile, like some of the ones that the Equifax or the Target breaches, like those haven't been. But I actually think that if you're a business owner, whether you're a medium-sized business owner or a small business owner or a large corporation, there are a lot of teams who are on pins and needles because there are some really bad things going on. The panel before was ransomware. There's been a huge uptake in these network ransomware initiatives where there's an organization called Fancy Bear that go by some other names as well. They took down the New Zealand Stock Exchange in May. It's serious that and it's not just there are many American businesses, global businesses who are being targeted by this ransomware event. And what's is kind of the bad news, and then I'll tell you the good news, is a lot of CISOs, like CIOs, CTOs receive these ransomwares and they don't know what to do until they pay it quietly because they don't want it to be they don't want to be on the cover to Wired. They just don't want to be on the cover to Wired as the example child. And so they pay it quietly and make them go away. And that's because these old hardware boxes that have held things together for the last 10 years aren't working in the new world of a cloud-based service that's much more infinitely scalable and stops these sorts of things. And so again, we've seen a lot of prospects pay it and or come under be like, my God, what do I do? And again, the good news is a service like Cloudflare and others can help now make that problem much easier. So that's good. And I know you said at the beginning, everyone knows us, but the truth is most of the world has no idea we exist. So we have to continue to raise our profile. No, like there are way better solutions today than there were 5 years ago to deal with these new things. So I guess the first part of your question is that there are some businesses that I've definitely seen an increase, and it's not just some segment. It's been small businesses, medium-sized, large corporations. And I do think there are a lot of people who are sweating the details behind the scenes. And that's a very violating experience. And so again, at Cloudflare, we really have been very busy this year, making sure that we can help our customers or potential customers solve these problems, because we want them to be ahead of it and protected, not behind. And we're lucky to say that our technology is very effective at stopping that. So I think there's that. So I guess that's the answer to your question, where, again, I think there are better solutions today that help bridge this than there were 5 years ago, but you have to know about them. You have to be using them. And if you're using antiquated technologies, then there's lots of gaps, and you are being subject to it. And I think that you and your kids have just been lucky so far.
Or maybe I'm lying and I've actually been paying ransomware like left and right.
Gonna go check. Let's do an audit of your bank account after. How about that?
That would be fine. I didn't mean that everybody knows everything about Cloudflare. Like, I don't think my mom has heard of it, but I just meant everybody at the Aspen Cyber Summit has heard of Cloudflare. Let's stay on cybersecurity for a minute. You recently gave an interesting interview where you said that cybersecurity is going to move to something more like a water treatment analogy. Tell me what you meant and what Cloudflare's role will play there.
It's so interesting. That's like, I'm not a very controversial person. I don't think anyone who knows me would say, oh, Michelle Zatlyn is not very controversial. That's probably the most controversial thing I've ever seen. I've ever said that really got a lot of people to set up. Some people really did not like it. And I meant it in a positive way, not the negative way. And, some of the feedback I got was, well, you're going to discourage people from getting into the industry. And I was like, well, no, people should get into cybersecurity. It's really important. We got a lot of work to be done. But, when I sit back and I think, okay, where is the world going? What's changed is these cloud-based network services. And again, this is very self-serving. Cloudflare is one of them. We're not the only cloud-based cybersecurity company, but there are many others. And I do think that the model, the architecture of what we're doing and others are doing is very well suited to help future-proof businesses for the next 10 years than what's happened in the last 10 years. And I'll just give you a quick history lesson for the folks listening, like a bit of context, and then I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by this water treatment plant. If you go back to the original specs of the internet, security was never built in, which is why we have all these cybersecurity companies. It was never built into the RFCs. It was kind of there. You can go find them, and at the bottom it says security to be included at a later date. Because originally the internet was invented to connect academic institutions, right? And so I don't really think Sir Tim really could envision everything it's become, connecting us and our music lessons and the communication and how we learn and how we do business. Like, it's really become this huge backbone to all of our lives, and how many people are online and how global it is. It's amazing. It's an amazing invention. We're so lucky to live in a world with all of it. And so what's changed is, again, these cloud-based services, technologies like machine learning and artificial intelligence. All of a sudden, if you think about cybersecurity, what happened for the last 10 years is if you were an attacker, a bad actor online, it was actually fairly easy to have more resources than any individual business. Because we had millions of businesses around the world, some really investing in it, some not. And so if you're a bad actor, you kind of just had to amass a certain amount of resources to overwhelm them, and they could really go a far way. What's happening in the cloud with a service like Cloudflare is, again, we now have 25 million internet properties, over 3 million businesses that are using Cloudflare. Okay, this is a lot of companies around the world, global, and all of a sudden we've been able to band all the legitimate businesses together, and we have way more resources than any one bad actor. It's just very hard to have more resources when you band all of those resources together. And so when you have a system like Cloudflare sitting in front of whatever your workload or application is behind the scenes, whatever passes through us, it's like we're a bouncer. We just stop any known attacker. And we know who the attacker is because we have 25 million data points to compare it against. And every second, billions of requests are going through our network. And we're just using machine learning and AI to figure out who's doing malicious things and who's not. And so it's all of a sudden, cybersecurity is a data science play. And those companies with really amazing data science, which we have, really amazing cybersecurity data, which we have a huge source because we have so many customers around the world, can start to build the technology to stop it. And this is what I mean by water treatment plants. Like back in the day, you couldn't just easily pour water from your tap. It wasn't trustworthy. And so a lot of multi-stakeholders got together and they said, okay, we want to be able to trust the water coming out of our taps. And I think that this is kind of a way that the internet's going to go over the next year, is that you're going to connect to a network like Cloudflare or others. We won't just be the only ones. And we will clean the traffic in the sense of getting rid of all the known malicious things and making it speedier and faster and better. So what comes out the other end is better for everyone. If you're a business, it's like, great, I don't have to deal with all those headaches anymore. If you're an end customer, like your kids, you can feel like you can click on any link you want because you have a lot of confidence that it's not going to bring malware or damaging things into your home environment. And so I hope that's the future. I mean, I think we should all hope that's the future 10 years from now, and where it's all more safe, all tides rise, and that all of a sudden you don't have to be spending 10 billion, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, billions of dollars on these solutions because you're worried. Like it should just everything should get safer, and the product development should get safer at all these application companies where you have intrinsic security, the way the code reviews, everything needs to get safer, and all tides have to rise. And we'll have a whole new set of challenges 10 years from now to deal with. That's what I hope the future is like, that it's just like, wow, we kind of go back and put in what the internet said to be completed at a later date. It's kind of like, I think we're doing that now, and it's going to come to fruition within the next 10 years.
I am all in favor of that, though. I'm not certain I want all the tides to rise if I'm working at a sewage treatment plant. So let me ask you a question from the audience because it's a great one. Michael Nelson. Years ago, Cloudflare entered into a partnership with Baidu. What's changed since then? What lessons can you share about working with Chinese companies and the Chinese government?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Thanks for the question, Michael. It's people are connecting around the world. And what's interesting is early on, we were a tiny, tiny company. And the second largest source of traffic from coming to Cloudflare customer sites was from China. So we had a lot of Chinese visitors trying to access information or do business on our early customer site. And that's continued. And then we have a lot of American companies who have big customer segments within China. So it's gone both ways. And so we really believed in having one global network around the world. And we had to find a way to work with a partner in China to help make one global network. Because again, Cloudflare helps make the internet faster, safer, and more reliable for any size business. That is our promise. And we felt really strongly that China had to be included in that. Like we didn't think it could be everyone except for China. And so we worked really hard early on. And so we were quite a young company when we really started to be serious about our Chinese strategy. And we partnered with Baidu, and we've since partnered with a second Chinese company called JD Cloud. And what that means is if you are a Cloudflare customer, if you are a large company like Garmin, they can use Cloudflare as a network sitting in front of all the Garmin devices, which are around the world, including in China. And they can have one uniform control plane for a performance, cybersecurity, and reliability stance. And what they've seen is a 4 times increase in ROI, and improvement in China increased by 400% because they have one global network to manage it. And so that's what a lot of the vision that we saw 5 years ago of why we thought that was so important has played out, where companies, some American, some European, turns out China's a huge market for them, and they want one architecture that works to provide this performance, security, and reliability. If you're the CIO of this company, it's like, great. You say to your CEO, it's great you want to go into China, but I got to manage it. And I don't want to have to manage a totally other network. And so to have this network layer that you can kind of see this control plane and have one set of cybersecurity, one set of protection, one set of global performance protection, one set of reliability makes a huge difference. Identity and access management makes a huge, huge difference in the complexities to the teams that have to hold these all together behind the scenes. And so I guess what's changed is we've added another partner with JD Cloud, and it's become more and more important. And we've seen a lot of businesses local in China who want to connect globally. These China businesses want to get access to the markets rest of the world. And they are saying, man, I need to get access to the European consumers and North American consumers. And I want one provider to be able to help me do that. And then we've seen so many multinationals out of America, Europe, the rest of Asia say, I need to be able to service China, and I want one provider to be able to do it. And so, I mean, that makes sense. We're all very connected. And again, it's kind of back to the internet's connected us all in many ways that I think we did not expect even 10 years ago.
What if the Chinese government says, hey, it's so great you have that Cloudflare in front of Garmin, but we'd really like access to that data because we want to know, where all of our dissidents happen to be jogging today, right? So how do you handle that request?
I have a lot. Turns out running a large technology company doing networking, I have a lot more gray hair than when I started because of questions like this. These are really serious questions, and I'll answer your question, but just zooming out, because that's a very Cloudflare specific question, but I think just zooming out, I strongly believe that if you're a technology company, the next 5 years is all about policy. The companies who really lean into understanding policy, partnering with policymakers, and the policymakers who become better technologists, those are the people who are going to invent the future, because it's just, they're colliding. You see it everywhere around the world. You see all these policy changes. You see some people very happy, some people very angry. And so there's like this huge multi-shareholder approach where people are saying, this isn't working, this is working great. And people are coming together and we're going to make progress. But I think the people who are really going to write the laws for the future, and this is why the Aspen Institute is so important, are the policymakers who become better technologists, and the technologists who become better policymakers. So this is an example of a question that if you're running a tech company, you have to be able to have an answer to. And I can almost guarantee that no tech entrepreneur starts thinking they're going to have to answer that question, right? Or if you're a CEO of a large company, you're like, I'm not qualified to make this answer. Let's call our GC, and the GC saying, well, I'm not qualified to, I don't know China, let's get some outside counsel. It's complicated. It just hasn't really had to come up. And so you got to be really thoughtful. There are some companies a bit ahead of you, but it's a small handful. And so in this question, we are a US law abiding organization. So we follow the law, and that means with court orders, if there's been due diligence, and again, there's lots of amazing things about the internet. There's some really ugly, gross, bad things that happen online. And with court orders and due process, we follow the law. We say, wow, okay, thank you, court order. This does seem legitimate. We should remove it from our network. And that happens all the time, and it does very well. But that's not your question. In this case, there is no court order. This is a government saying, I want this. And it's not even that. Sometimes it's the US government, sometimes it's other governments. And, we have a story where we are a 40-person company. We got served with a national security letter. When you're a 40-person company, this was years and years ago, we're a lot larger now, we're over 1,700 people now. But it was a really scary event. And it was actually the US government asking for a bunch of information. And so we worked with the EFF and ended up suing the US government. We said, because the national security letter at the time had no due process. We said, there needs to be due process if you want us to comply with this. And so we ended up winning the case, which is why I can talk about it. And it became a big example. And so we've been very principled on this point, where we're a law-abiding organization with due process, but we're not otherwise, no. And so in this case, the answer is no. And we've taken a very hard stance about that. And we've been very principled. We've written about a ton. We've drawn very strong lines in the sand. And we think that's really important to not undermine the trust of our customers.
All right, well, right as we reach perhaps the most complex issue in technology and policy, we are at time. I want to say thank you to Michelle, and I hope that Garrett and Vivian, I hope you caught that little bit. We said the next 5 years of technology are about policy, because that is going to be great for the trailer for the Aspen Cyber Summit in 2021. All right, we're leaving now. We'll be back in just a minute with more Aspen Cyber Summit. Thank you so much.
Thanks again for joining us in the 5th annual Aspen Cyber Summit. I'm John Carlin, the chair of Aspen's Digital Cybersecurity Program, and the full summit agenda and bios of all of our speakers are available at aspencybersummit.org. I want to thank again FireEye, Intel, and Proofpoint for making this year's summit possible and helping us convene such an important set of conversations, and to help us understand what is such a complicated year. We'd also like to acknowledge Blue Vector, SICPA, NA, and the American Gas Association for their additional support. We've had some great speakers today, and we are reaching our final session. We'll be back tomorrow at noon Eastern Time to hear from the Director of the U.S. Secret Service, Jim Murray. Now, to close today, a great conversation coming up among 3 members of our Aspen Cybersecurity Group to talk about the modern threat landscape, moderated by Sue Hennessy, the Executive Editor of Lawfare. Sue, take it away.
Hello, everyone. Sorry, let me just make sure this is up. Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for joining us today, and to Aspen for hosting what is really another excellent forum, even under these less than ideal operating conditions of kind of the current moment. I'm really excited for this discussion about cyber threats and the challenges and landscapes that await the new Biden administration and the 117th Congress. With me are 2 of the most knowledgeable and experienced people really in the world on the issues that the new president is going to confront come January. They don't really need introduction, so I'll keep it pretty brief. Sue Gordon is the former Principal Deputy Director of Intelligence and is currently a Rubenstein Fellow at Duke University, among a number of other roles. Alex Stamos is the Director of the Stanford Internet Observatory, and previously he was the former Chief Security Officer at Facebook. So thank you both so much for joining me. One quick note before we kick off, time permitting, we will try and take some audience questions at the end. The chat feature is enabled throughout the session, so if you just want to put in a brief question, indicate who you would like to answer it. We'll try and pull a few at the end and pray that it doesn't exceed my Zoom aptitude. So with that, we have an immense amount of ground to cover in this really meaty topic. So I figured we'd kind of dive right in with a topic that I think is still sort of at top of mind for a lot of people, and that's the 2020 election. You both have worked really extensively on election security, both in the lead up to 2016 and certainly in the 4 years since 2016, from really pretty different vantage points. So I'm curious to know sort of what you were most worried about heading into Election Day, and kind of from this 3 weeks later, kind of what your assessment is on how it went. So Sue, if we want to start with you.
Great question, Susan. Great to see you. Alex, great to share a stage with you. You know what my biggest concern was? It was that the previous year, and even the 3 years from 2016 on, and all the conversations around it and all the lead up to the election would have disenfranchised the American voter. My greatest fear was that Americans would say, you know what, we can't trust it. It doesn't matter. This is all just inconsequential anymore, and that they wouldn't show up. So my greatest joy is that for all of this, the American people still believed. They believed their voice mattered. They believed the system was worthy of their trust, and they showed up in massive numbers and exercised the most fundamental right and one of the greatest differentiators we have as a nation. So kind of my greatest fear and my greatest joy is in the notion that our citizens believed and they showed up.
So Alex, sort of same question for you. What was your nightmare scenario going into this, and what's your assessment of how we fared?
So my nightmare scenario, and thanks for hosting, Susan, and great to be on with you, Sue. Nightmare scenario was attacks against the election infrastructure to try to drive the election into chaos and to create the situation where a significant number of people thought the election was stolen. And this is something I wrote about actually in Lawfare last year. I had this big kind of sci-fi piece of all the bad things that could happen. And the great thing is that the foreign attacks against infrastructure, we have no evidence of that happening. That doesn't mean that there's no vulnerabilities at all. There certainly continue to be security vulnerabilities at a couple of different levels of the individual infrastructures, which, as anybody who's watching this knows by this point, is run by something like 8,000 different election authorities, at local and state authorities. Those vulnerabilities continue to exist, but what we saw in the run-up to 2020 was a collaboration between FBI, Cyber Command, NSA, and especially DHS's CISA to work with all those locals and states to patch as many vulnerabilities as possible to put monitoring in place. So there's lots of different monitoring capabilities that were put in place so that there was centralized teams that could see if there were attacks, and then to have rapid reaction in case there were any. And from everybody I've spoken to who worked on that collaboration, it was very, very quiet. There were a couple of foreign attempts around disinformation, most specifically the Iranian attempt to try to pretend to be the Proud Boys, in which they released a video in which they claimed to have all of this, to have submitted all of these fake ballots. And like, we actually debunked that on our website, eipartnership.net. We've got a whole post of a screen-by-screen analysis of the video. We still don't know exactly what was behind the Hunter Biden stories. So there is the possibility that there was some kind of hack and leak or influence operation embedded in that. I'm looking forward to seeing what the FBI finds out under a new administration about what happened there. But for the most part, we saw very little in the way of foreign interference, and that was fantastic. The downside is the kicker of my piece from last year was the idea of the president, most specifically, trying to convince people the election was stolen using the evidence of a number of foreign attacks. Turns out he didn't need any actual evidence, right? And even though there's no good evidence of anything happening, there's no foreign interference, nothing really broke in a way that could change the outcome. That was not necessary for a massive domestic disinformation attempt.
So, sort of assuming that this premise is right? So, CISA Director Chris Krebs sort of said, just another Tuesday on the internet. It really appears that there was an absence of attempts, at least. And assuming that holds, sort of, why didn't we see more foreign adversaries playing a role this year? I mean, in the lead up to the election, government officials were warning about ransomware and targeting voter infrastructure. We saw really sort of aggressive action out of Cyber Command with the TrickBot operation. Is your instinct that all this great work that Alex just described, sort of federal government partnerships, state and local, we were just so well prepared that they didn't even bother to try? Or do you think there's something else at work?
So probably three things. One is we did shut down a lot of routes that they had been using, right? Both technically and in terms of education. Just particularly the last 2 years, that was really aggressive with state and local, really aggressive with the citizenry on everything from actual interference to influence. I think we had shut down a lot of the easy routes that were going to be available. The second thing is that the interests of our adversaries and competitors change too, in terms of how they're going to affect their national interests and whether the election is going to be the way they use the cyberspace to affect their interests. And so I'm not sure that all our adversaries saw the election as their most effective way to achieve influence. So you see the ransomware, you see the attacks on the COVID, you see the triangle shaping around that, because that was a much more opportunistic target than perhaps the election. So I think that's the second, is whether the interests of our adversaries were really all election focused. And then the last is, and I've written and spoken about this, the Russians' intention is to undermine democracy. And if you go as far back as the Cold War and their active measures, which were psyops and influence operations just done non-digitally, active measures where you launch them and then they take on a life of their own. Well, if I'm the Russians and I'm looking at what we're doing, we were doing a really good job undermining our own elections. And they could in some way sit back. So some we took away the route, and others, there was no need to achieve that aim. We were doing a pretty good job at the time. So it's some combination of those three. Probably.
So Alex, sort of relatedly, one of, I think, the most impactful features of sort of 2016 interference was large scale hack and dump operations, sort of along the lines of what Sue just described. You do something, you let it, you seed the chaos and you let it play out and see what happens. Are you surprised that we didn't see that replicated, or apparently didn't see it replicated sort of successfully? And is it too early to draw lessons from why not?
So, I mean, one, I think it is too a little bit too early in that there were a number of stories based upon leaked or stolen data for which we don't know what the origin was, right? So I would like to give us a little more time and to see a report about some of those stories and whether or not, there's very possibly a folder with a red cover on it sitting on a desk right now that has firm attribution. That folder is just not going to come out until we have a new administration. But that being said, yes, I mean, I think out of the different kinds of influence operations in 2016, the hack and leak was by far the most effective. I absolutely have no experience next to Sue as to the motivations of our adversaries. And I think she had a great answer here on the rational self-interest issue. And I think it applies to the hack and leak as well. I think one of the things that has happened since 2016 is you see this collaboration between, Cyber Command defending forward, where they are actually in the networks of some of these influence operators. This is one of the big failings we had in the run up to 2016. It was nobody's job at the tech companies to handle influence operations. It was nobody's job really in the US government, right? Like it was kind of a side thing that we all did alongside our normal threat intelligence work. It wasn't a dedicated field. That has completely changed, right? There's clearly dedicated teams inside NSA Cyber Command. There's dedicated teams at the big tech companies. There's a task force inside the FBI, and they're working with DHS CISA. And that collaboration led to many, many disruptions of influence operators over the last 2 years, especially, that have been done very publicly. And so if you're sitting in GRU in the aquarium and you're trying to think what your strategy is, one of the things you have to assume is that whatever you do, there is going to be strong, undeniable attribution of your actions. And I think that changes the calculus here, because if you're living in a world where there's a decent chance that General Nakasone is reading your email and that they're collaborating with the social media companies that have the ability then to match up any technical indicators to all of this activity, then you're not going to get away with anything you try. And I think that goes to the rational self-interest of, you can't stop this stuff, but what you can do is create some level of risk for them by raising the attribution bar, by having the capability to have very high confidence of who is behind certain influence operations, and then making it clear that there will be a penalty be paid if they're not effective in changing the outcome of the election.
So one sort of on this point of public attribution, one feature that I think was pretty novel in 2020 was at least a few cases of close to real-time government attribution with a fair amount of detail to the public. So we saw a number of statements coming from Bill Albanina regarding sort of Russia, Iran, and China that drew mixed reactions from the Hill about sort of how candid or clear those assessments were and whether or not they were politically shaded. Right before the election, we saw this, I think I've never seen a press conference quite like it, in which DNI Ratcliffe came out, FBI Director Wray, Director of CISA Chris Krebs, and John Demers of NSD, and sort of announced this Iranian email hoax that Alex referred to earlier about sort of the Proud Boys. Sort of what is your assessment as someone who served in the intelligence community for a really long time about how those sort of public engagement in terms of combating foreign disinformation, how it went? Did it restore public confidence? Is it a roadmap moving forward, or was it just sort of a strange sort of sideshow that ended up being politicized a little bit itself?
So the good news is, I think we're on, I'll just take the election security, a 4-year journey from the unclassified intelligence community assessment of Russian interference in the 2016 election. Think about that. That was an unclassified assessment. That is such a bold move, but I think it was reflective of a trend that in the digital environment, the threat surface and the decision maker are increasingly not in the government. And so if the job of the intelligence community is national security, and the people making decisions about national security are in the private sector and in the populace, you have got to find a way to share information with them. So I think you're seeing a really good trend of sharing threat information. And it goes back before that with sharing cyber information, but this speaking directly to the public, I think is necessary and something we're going to continue to see. The bad news is this is hard for us. We're just not very good about how we both protect the advantage that we have and share the information openly. And intelligence is weird. It's typically fragmentary, and you're always, particularly in this case, trying to make the decision of whether you're actually improving the situation or you're adding uncertainty and fear without the ability to do something on it. So I think it's still an art that we're developing. I feel a lot about, yeah, that last press conference was weird. Yes, there's just a whole lot of storyline around it in terms of where we're trying to downplay Russia and play up somebody else. But I take an overwhelmingly positive view of it. Number one is, man, if you had told us 4 years ago that we would be able to turn that threat information around that quickly, I think we would have told you that we couldn't. And I kind of put it in the same category of what I see the social media companies trying to do in terms of doing their part on disinformation. I don't know that they have it quite right yet, but I do love that they're taking some responsibility for it. So I think you're going to see more openness from the government. You're going to see the government get better and better at it. I love the timeliness of it. And I think we're on the right track to try and give the information to the people that are the best decision makers about countering the threat.
Yeah, so I think one piece of the picture we certainly don't have the full sense of yet is what the communication between the government and social media companies might have looked like behind the scenes in terms of sharing that background information. But we did see social media companies offering their own attribution and sort of and taking their own steps. So, you know, Alex, sort of how do you score how social media companies handled it this time around? In the past, I think I'm fairly stating that you've said that you think that the sort of traditional media has sort of shared a big part of the blame and sort of in irresponsibly amplifying some of this stuff. Do you think that traditional media did a better job this cycle?
Yeah, so there's some big questions there. I mean, so one, the attribution has changed for social media companies in that there's a whole series of newspaper articles about my fight around attribution inside of Facebook, of it being something that was resisted by kind of the political teams. And that resistance seems to have mostly fallen away in the last 4 years, which is great for them to just come out. You know, the model used to be we give our attribution to the government and we allow the government to speak on our behalf. And so the fact that companies are doing their own is great. How did they do overall? I think on foreign interference, they did really well, right? So the collaboration between the companies and their government partners worked out really well. There are no good signs of any propaganda activity from any foreign sources being effective. That didn't mean they didn't try. And we're writing up a big report in which we're going to talk about the ways they tried, but none of it looks very effective. The problem for social media this time around, just as the general problem was domestic disinformation, which is a much harder policy issue, right? It's very easy to come up with a rule that says that you're not allowed to staff up a team in St. Petersburg that can pretend to be Americans to affect American democracy, and then to expand that rule out to the world. Deciding what is allowable speech in the United States by actual Americans involving an election is a very, very difficult one, especially because there's absolutely no laws here, right? This is completely First Amendment protected speech. There's not even civil liability for almost any of this disinformation. It is something that for which there's no kind of legal backstop for the companies to look at. And as a result, their policies are much broader. And the most important disinformation was from domestic sources, and it was from influencers. That was the other big change we saw in 2020, was that we have real, kind of pretty good quantitative evidence that for any one of these themes of disinformation, of Sharpie Gate or Dominion voting systems or the CIA having a secret, I know Sue was actually part of probably building the secret supercomputer that has the magical ability to change votes. We shouldn't even joke about it because they're just going to take a snapshot of this and put it on Newsmax. That was a joke. That was a joke. It didn't happen. Yeah. Right. So those kinds of things only went big because they're being driven by people with very large followings, some of whom were directly related to the president and his campaign, many of whom are kind of in the conservative influencer sphere of having these very large followings. And that is a challenge to the platforms because those people drive a huge amount of traffic. And I think one of the recommendations we're going to have in our report is that the companies are going to have to think about their policies less about something that is applied fairly across all the accounts. You can't treat somebody with 100 Twitter followers with somebody who has 1.5 million followers. Facebook can't treat like just a guy in his garage with an opinion in Michigan the same as somebody who reaches 1.5 million people via Facebook live stream, right? Some of these people on YouTube and Facebook especially have a viewership that approaches the daytime viewership of CNN by themselves, right? Which shows you how the economics work here, because they don't have to have a whole building at Columbus Square or Columbus Circle, and they don't have to have all the staff and such. They can run it with like 3 or 4 people. Those are the people who are the problem. And in those situations, the companies are much less like the telephone company or traditional kind of social media companies, and they're much more like a cable network. And this especially applies to YouTube, which has effectively become the Comcast of disinformation, in that they are carrying all of these live streams of alternatives to that are far outside of even Fox News, and with these large audiences. And it's very difficult, one, for them to intermediate on real live streams, but also the mitigations that were put in place, such as labeling a post, makes a lot more sense in kind of a standalone text post than it does in a video that somebody might be watching for hours on end. And so I think that's going to be the big challenge now for the companies to think about, is what do they do with the folks for whom they're giving these huge audiences for, but then with whom they have like a really important financial relationship, right? And that's, I think, where they fell down a bit, and they're going to have more editorial control, because that is what's driving the problem right now.
So obviously, one of the most significant sources of disinformation surrounding the election was the president himself. We talked about sort of the need for, the government to provide attribution, to give context to the public. The person who was doing that, CISA Director Chris Krebs, was fired essentially for telling the truth about the elections while the president was lying. You yourself were pushed out in circumstances where lots of people speculated that kind of the genuine concern was that you might be a little too honest or a little too principled for the president's taste. Is there a solution to that beyond just electing people who take their obligations to sort of election integrity seriously and differently, or do you think there are tools, policy changes, legislative tools available to sort of address not just the challenges of domestic disinformation that Alex is talking about for all those complicated reasons, but domestic disinformation from the pinnacle, the bully pulpit, kind of the president and the executive branch himself?
What an incredibly meaty question. Brief digression, and good job, Chris. There are political appointees who head departments and agencies, and they're important because, the president and their administration are trying to do things and affect policies, and you need people who can translate those policies into the actions of their departments. But the bureaucracy is really important too, because it keeps order and fairness and transparency. And then there's a special group of what I'm going to call the independents, and that's intelligence, and it's law enforcement, and it's what CISA represented. And these are people who, even though they have political titles, their real job is to just play it straight down the middle, and their role is, and that is hard to do in a withering political environment. And I got to tell you, not only did Chris do a great job with his job in leading the women and men of CISA, but in the last days when there were other choices he could have made about what he continued to say, and he just played it straight down the middle. So yay, Chris Krebs, and yay, CISA, for doing the great work with the rest of the community to secure the election. Listen, I think our system tends to figure itself out. And everyone has to play their role here. So, the Constitution provides for the president. The president has a voice. There's no rule that says he has to be right about what he's doing. There's no rule that says his policies have to be good. And we vote every 4 years. And we, the American people, decide whether that's what they want, whether we want. And I think that vote happened. And so even though it is never what I would have the president do, no, and I think it's destructive, I do believe our system will sort it out in a couple of ways. One, we voted. Two, I think you will see tools put in place to try and get back to much more honesty in how information is broadcast. And 3, I'm hoping we're going to get the Congress to leap into the fray a little bit more and not just be silent when they know things are going on. And then what you're going to have is a bureaucracy continue to recognize that it has to be strong and play its role and not shy away from it. So it is so uncomfortable what's going on. It is so antithetical to something that we ever thought, and it is so potentially destructive. But if you go up to the 10,000 foot level, the system is going to respond to this, not only with policies and actions, but all the players are going to figure out how to roll. And look, we aren't having rioting in the streets. We are going to have a transition of power. The American people did come out and vote, and our system will get stronger. So I hate it. I think it's incredibly irresponsible. But I do think that this is the joy of the American system, is we tend to have more than one path that we can learn.
So we tend to talk about this issue of disinformation in the election context. That's sort of a lot of the public debate, surrounds the election, where there are very specific rules and sort of markers between foreign and domestic. I think it's reasonable to suspect that the disinformation threat more broadly is going to be a persistent national security threat that exists in other contexts outside of, sort of purely the election context. Alex, how should we understand kind of disinformation writ large, and are there sort of lessons from what we've learned in the election context that are going to apply to COVID vaccines and the sort of the huge both immediate and long-term challenges as sort of nation states move to using this tool and using sort of a cyber-enabled version of the kind of traditional propaganda of reaching out and attempting to shape perceptions of the world.
Yeah, so I think both on what you might call the hard cyber, right, the traditional cyber side, and the disinformation side, I think the first goal for the Biden administration needs to be to get to the same level where we were on the election and to make that permanent, right? So all of those collaborations, all of that work that went into public and private partnerships, as well as collaboration within the government between the offensive, the intelligence, and the defensive sides of cyber, that needs to become a permanent thing. Right, like the lessons that are learned there. I was able to give a briefing to a government agency before, and that's one of the things I said is like, please don't just go on vacation November 4th. Not like they're going to go on vacation, but that we can't let these ties bind. And I think that's true in disinformation. You mentioned my biggest concerns around the COVID vaccines. One, vaccines are already an area of a lot of disinformation because there's a lot of people that have deeply held concerns about vaccine safety. A lot of that goes back to some, bad scientific studies that got lots of widespread coverage, and then the fact that those studies were retracted, and the author of one of them actually went to jail, was not retracted. The vaccines are also interesting because it's unlike the political sphere, the political disinformation. It's something that's attractive to a very interesting cross section of different communities around the country. Right? There's different ethnic groups, different religious conservative groups whom disagree on everything else, who agree on anti-vax. And so it's a really interesting issue in the United States specifically. And then third, anti-vax, the vaccine stuff is going to be a big deal with foreign activity. Before the election, we were doing a lot of work on COVID disinformation. And this is one of the first areas around COVID that we've seen the People's Republic of China kind of come out to play in English. That the combination of the Hong Kong uprisings and COVID has made the PRC massively invest in their capability of doing disinformation in the United States. And that is not going to change with the vaccine. In fact, I think the vaccine's actually going to behind it, because these vaccines are effectively national tools. You don't just talk about, we don't just say Pfizer, we say like the American team, the American German team, the Chinese team, the Russian team. And so we're going to possibly see lots of disinformation about it, as well as arguments about fair distribution and the like. And so I think that is where, if I would suggest the administration start of, if we're going to try to adopt what happened around election cooperation we should start with the COVID vaccine as the core target there, and then use that instead of building something temporary to build permanent structures to deal with this. And that's where we have a lot of interesting challenges in the government, is that while you have these task force between these agencies, there's no single coordinating body for it. And CISA coordinated a lot of this because they had the primary responsibility to defend the election from cyber attack. And so they kind of inherited the disinformation side. Do we expect the FDA and Health and Human Services and the CDC to have their own counter disinformation teams? No, that seems a little silly, right? And so this is an opportunity for us to think about ways to have new centralized capabilities in the government that then provide support to the subject matter experts in places like the FDA and CDC, and then to have a coordination that comes out of hopefully a White House that now actually has an interagency process on this.
And so sort of, as we think about disinformation that spreads into, non-election contexts, how do you think about sort of what the role of the intelligence community is? So we talk about the government as sort of this monolithic thing that's, they combat disinformation, they detect it, they respond to it, they warn the public. Sometimes they lie about it. Sometimes they share information with state and locals. But it's part intelligence, it's part law enforcement, it's part infrastructure, it's part diplomacy. To the extent that part of the job here is also defining what's not sort of the mission of particular groups. From your perspective, in terms of the intelligence community, how would you define their role moving forward?
So before I get to that, just to pick up on Alex's and go beyond just the disinformation, I think actually CISA had a pretty interesting playbook that we can replicate in other national security domains that are a little more uncommon, like pandemics, like climate, like any sort of thing. It was the reaching from federal all the way to state and local, because it's at state and local where the action really happens. And when in 2016, when we started trying to figure out how we were going to do election security, and we started having conversations with state and local, the gap between the way federal does it and the way state and local does it, the gap between the resources was so huge, you almost couldn't imagine how we were going to get there. And we did. And you can imagine that we don't have that in place for pandemics. We don't really have that in place for big climate events. So I think that there's some playbooks that can go into effect from election security to other kind of broad national events that manifest locally. Back to the role of the intelligence community. I think our great space is knowing a little more a little sooner. Mostly about, and I think still about, what our foreign adversaries and competitors' first intent and then actions are. I think that's it. It is, at its best, intelligence is about warning. Intelligence is about the advantage of information. We would love it if we could see attacks coming at the moment. That typically isn't the way intelligence works. It's best when we can share good specific information on intent, in vector, in character. And I think that's what you're going to see us continue to do. The question is, where's our focus going to be? Our focus historically has been on military systems and weapons and political systems. Are we going to get the same information on economic drivers? Are we going to be able to see digital activities in the same way we can? So I think it's the same mission that intelligence has always been. I think you should think of it much more strategically than tactically, because, and I think, Alex, you can jump in on this one. When you've gotten the best information from the intelligence community, it's when you know what our adversaries are trying to do. And then you can marry it up with the observables that typically the recipient will have much more than the intelligence community would. And so the problem is, Susan, this is a culturally difficult thing for intelligence to do, because intent is typically the most highly classified and the most closely protected. And so to give that up openly is going to be a challenge, but I think that's where the game is. But what do you think, Alex? Do you think I'm right in terms of what the most valuable piece that the intelligence community offers here?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think as somebody who had defensive responsibility in the situations in which U.S. Intelligence community was helpful, it was because they told us this is what you can expect. This is what they're interested in. Because the challenge for any chief security officer or anybody who does kind of the broader set of risk management is there's an infinite number of bad things that can happen, right? It is really easy to Monday morning quarterback and to say afterwards, oh, well, they should have prepared for this specific thing. But when you're sitting in the chair, there's an infinite search space of possible attacks and attempts on you, and a very large, not infinite, but large set of adversaries who might do it. And so when somebody tells you this specific adversary who has this history of these capabilities has this intention, it takes that infinite search space and it narrows it down to something that's actually actionable. Even if they don't tell you this is the IP you got to worry about, or this is the malware you've got to worry about, or it's coming on Tuesday. If they tell you this is what they're interested in, then you can go and you can sit with your team. You can have your red team simulate their TTPs. You can go do a tabletop exercise. You can go, do a number of war games. You can put your money and your people where it is, because that's also the other consistent challenge of security is even in the best financed and the most responsible organizations, it's still about portfolio management, that you have to decide where are you going to deploy the always limited resources you have. And so having that knowledge from the Intel community is super helpful. I understand though the challenge of that gets tough. Even if you're able to if you're a big company, you have people with clearances, it's still hard, right? So I've had a number of jobs where I've had people under me with TSSCIs who could go get those briefings. I've been able to get pop-up clearances, and it's hard in those cases. And then those companies are only like 50 or 60 of the Fortune 500, right? You're only talking about big tech, big finance, oil and gas, defense industrial base of being the organizations that can play at that level. The rest of the Fortune 500 and the rest of American industry don't have those relationships, don't have the people with clearances, don't have threat intel teams, don't have red teams that can simulate the TTPs of government adversaries. That is actually, I think, a huge challenge for us to address as a society is how do we handle those folks? But yes, on the high end, it's fantastic to have that partnership.
I think this is a good place to sort of pivot to one of the kind of underlying organizational or structural issues at play here, which is, I think it's not controversial to say in the last 4 years, the intelligence community has taken a real beating in terms of public confidence, institutional confidence, both privately between the government and companies and publicly between the government and citizens is sort of the necessary component to all of this. If information is going to be valuable and useful, it has to be credible. Sue, kind of what work do you think the Biden administration needs to do to repair and rebuild, institutional confidence in trust, sort of generally, but the IC specifically?
So I'm thinking about your question as I'm listening to it. I think the Biden administration, to answer your question, and then I'll muse for a second. I think what the Biden administration needs to do is to give it standing and put on it expectation, because those two things, if you recognize its value and you put a demand on its character, then I think it will take about a minute to restore anything that's been lost. Because one of the most amazing things about the intelligence community, and I'd say the national security community at large, is the women and men that toil there are really intentional, really driven. It doesn't mean they're not susceptible to backing off under having their integrity challenged. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. It doesn't mean that they always are as modernly effective as they might be, but they are intentional. And so in the face of a president who says, I need you, I value you, and you must be worthy of that, I think it'll turn around. I'm not sure I believe that the intelligence community has lost the trust of the American people. In a weird sort of way, it was almost the tussle between the president and the intelligence community that had the American people kind of comforted that there was intelligence doing the hard work of saying something that was inconvenient. And that's always been true about intelligence. It's just we don't always have presidents saying out loud that they don't believe it, but that it is an inconvenient thing. And so in a weird sort of way, I'm not sure that we've lost the trust of the American people with the intelligence community. And again, Alex is going to be better than me on this. I actually think we're doing, compared to 10 years ago, we're doing really well with the private sector comparatively between the intelligence community. In part, and I was listening to, I can't remember who the previous speaker was, talking about just the distance we've traveled in terms of how the government seeks information from companies, from how the government doesn't try and over-regulate things that are going to crush them economically. I think we've shared more information. So I actually think with the private sector, the intelligence community is doing better than it's been with the American people. I'm not sure we've lost their confidence. I think what we have to reestablish is their value and their expectation. And then I think it'll turn around pretty quickly.
So Alex, I mean, I think that answer gets at the extent to which, yes, there's sort of restoration work to be done, but there's also really important substantive work to be done. So whenever we sort of think about the 117th Congress, like what are the big legislative priorities that you think, look, like we're down to business, here's places in which it's important work is to be done, and maybe there's some political space to start doing it.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot I think Congress can do, and there's like the direct cyber stuff, and then there's a bunch of things that touch upon it, right? So on the direct, kind of my number one priority is actually something that we don't talk about a lot is we see a tiny fraction of the breaches of American companies in the public reporting that we discuss, right? So anybody who has worked as a consultant for companies as an incident responder knows that we're probably seeing 5 or 10% of the breaches of the successful breaches that happen. And we're seeing 0.5% of the close calls. This is not true in other areas where you have very complex systems that you regulate and that you manage up to a high level of safety, right? So imagine a world in which we only talked about 1 out of 10 plane crashes. Would we actually be able to improve airplane safety? And the reason for that is that the regulations around whether you have to disclose a breach or not are all state regulations. Almost all of them are based upon this bill that came out of California, SB 1386, which is really about consumer data. And it has a definition of PII around social security numbers and such. That is a very kind of old school idea of what are hackers looking for. Truth is, you can just go buy a dump of every social security number in the United States from a number of data brokers for a couple $1,000s, right? Like that kind of data is not that interesting anymore to hackers. The stuff that is really national security importance is the intellectual property, is the economic espionage, is the attacks against our industrial base, both small companies and big, which is happening continuously and still happening continuously, especially from China, although there's now a much larger set of countries that are trying to copy the Chinese model of economic development. And so the first thing I would have Congress do is we need to have a federal disclosure law, but instead of a federal breach disclosure law that is based around PII, we need a much broader set of requirements of what requires a disclosure, and then a phased disclosure process by which disclosure can happen privately very, very quickly, and that you can bring in the FBI, you can bring in CISA, you can bring in the defensive folks, you can notify the folks on the IC side to see if they have a way that they can help out, and that eventually that we have a root cause analysis of all of these different things that happen. Right now, that's happening through class action lawsuits. And that is the absolute worst way to try to regulate an incredibly complicated area like this is through class action lawsuits, to be honest. We had a tangling with the Russian FSB when I was at Yahoo that ended up with years and years of me being deposed, which is totally fine. But these lawyers, the tens of thousands of hours they spent looking at documents and emails was not about figuring out what went wrong, what can we do better as a society. It was about getting these Florida class action lawyers a $45 million settlement, right? All of that information was then just wrapped up and tied away under a protective order because the company made a deal. That's ridiculous. As a society, that's ridiculous. Again, when the 737 MAX crashed, if Boeing could just pay off a set of lawyers and then there was no public discussion of what went wrong, right, nothing would ever get better. And so we need a model where there's both a carrot and a stick for companies to disclose this stuff. The carrot might be something like civil liability protections and then, statutory damages or something. This is one of the things I think we can look at a number of industries like vaccine safety and the like for what these kinds of things look like. But then lots of carrots to get them to voluntarily disclose. And then we need a NTSB-like model where instead of all the stuff being wrapped up, you get the 500-page report of these were the root causes of what caused this failure. And this is what everybody else in our society can learn from it. And that would be absolutely the first thing I would start with from Congress, because without the data of what's actually happening, we can't make any other decisions. And all of that stuff is locked up in private incident response companies, law firms, and the like, and it's not being used to make anything better.
So what Alex is describing is obviously playing out against these sort of much larger global trends. What do you think are going to be sort of the context that define, sort of the next few years and the cyber agenda for the next few years?
So I think I loved Alex's answer. I think that is one of probably 3 or 4 pillars: data privacy, data integrity, data share. I mean, just a number of issues that are going to be so important for us to not only manage our own space, but how we're going to manage data sharing with our partners. How we're going to maintain technological leadership, because otherwise everyone's going to go back and be nationalistic. So I think it was such a good answer. And there are probably 3 or 4 things related that we really need to address in the way he said. I think one of the biggest challenges that we're going to have is the next 4 years are going to be disproportionately dominated by COVID, by the economy, by climate, and by social issues. I just think that is going to take so much of our national attention, that one of the things that we're going to have to do to address these big transnational issues about Chinese expansionism, about brazen Russian capabilities, about so much still unregulated, uncountered cyber activity. Where are we going to get the partnership? Where are we going to have the international opportunities? And I think if we could wrap some of those opportunities around the discussions of COVID and the economy, and climate and some of the others, we can get at some of the vexing transnational issues, because we can protect really hard here, but the world is so connected that we have to also get our allies involved in some of these standards if we both want to do the trade and the tech development that we need to, and also the protection. And I think those are going to be hard agreements to come by. I think it is not the time that we're going to have a lot of energy if they aren't coupled to some of the more values-driven approaches to getting the data and information security issue addressed globally.
So as a person who's actually a DC resident, do you feel though the fact that Congress is going to be distracted by the culture wars and such as actually a benefit of perhaps you can have movement on something like cyber by attaching it to the NDAAs and such, that it is an area where you can maybe have some bipartisan work that happens together?
Yeah, so maybe the problem is there are a lot of bipartisan views of how you solve these problems, of how restrictive you are, how open you are, how much your national security, how much your privacy. And I worry a little bit about the split Congress in terms of being able to come to agreement. So that's why I might wrap more of my attempts around transparency, authenticity, integrity, rather than getting right into some of those issues that are going to really test the bipartisanship that I just don't think is going to be there yet. So I don't mean to be depressing about this, because I almost always see adversity as opportunity. I just think we have to be realistic about how many fronts we're going to be able to attack. I do think that the national security team is shaping up to be a good cyber team. And I think we're advantaged by the cyber solarium that they will feel some obligation to actually follow through on those. But I think we also just ought to realize how many different ways this administration is going to be pulled and how hard it is going to be to get bipartisan work through.
Yeah, I feel like one of the forcing functions was the TikTok issue, which
Yep.
there was kind of a general consensus that the Trump administration was handling it poorly. And then a surprising bipartisan consensus of how you could do it in a better way, which I thought maybe is there is something there that could drive, I mean, I think from my perspective, like tech regulation is just really a national security issue because you're totally right. It plays out in long-term competitiveness with China, our partnership with Europe and the like.
Yeah, I think we need to, and again, don't get me wrong, I think there's plenty of openings to do it. And I think there's a lot of recognition that closed won't work, right? We can't all shut down and all do things within our borders and all not allow the openness. But that last mile, I think, is going to be hard to come. So I think it's going to take some focus. Maybe we take your area that you mentioned first and just build on it.
So I'm going to throw one more impossible to answer a complicated question on both of you before I fulfill my promise to actually take some audience questions. Alex did a nice segue talking about TikTok. Obviously, Russia has taken up a ton of oxygen over the last 4 years. But if you really parse the statements coming out of government officials, the intelligence community, the Bureau, they're talking about China as sort of being the substantial long-term threat. The Trump administration tried a lot of different things in this space. Some were successful, some were not successful. Whenever you look at sort of the incoming Biden administration and China in the cyber context, an administration that as Vice President Biden was part of negotiating the Xi agreement that I think has fallen apart in the intervening years. What is sort of the big priorities or sort of contextual understanding that you think the new administration should have in charting, this really, really critical part of its cyber policy in deciding how to engage with and confront China? Either of you can go first.
Yeah, I'll go short though, Alex, and just give you enough room in there. China is still going to be the priority. I think what the Trump administration actually did was awaken us to the economic impact of what had been a growing threat such that we could deal with it. We had known that what China was doing for a long time. It really has been the last 4 years when we looked at it economically, you now see the security risk and it's playing out. So I think China is still a concern. I think we have been awakened about the intellectual property, the theft piece of it. And so we're going to have to, they will keep pressing on the data security piece. I think the next piece they need to take on is just the supply chain and the technological interdependence of all our systems and address some of these questions about how you can protect what is critical while still allowing your individuals and your companies to participate globally. And if you don't do that with China, you aren't going to be able to do it with anyone else. And so I think those are all there. I think we made huge progress on understanding this problem by the highlighting of the Huawei and the 5G issue. Probably, if I had my wish list, I'd had this administration take on AI because it had it. My dog agrees. We haven't yet codified a disadvantageous position in AI. And so we could take some of our lessons learned, put some ethic around it, put some security around it, and get ourselves perhaps more internationally prepared on that front. What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, so I'm going to approach it from kind of the defensive side. So I think we have been whistling past the graveyard on Chinese capabilities for quite a while. Whatever strategy comes out of the administration has to recognize that the Chinese have spent the last 10 years building an absolutely incredible public-private partnership around offensive security that outstrips our capabilities by a decent amount. And the example that I brought up on Twitter that I think people need to pay attention to, there's this thing called the Tianfu Cup, which is their big cybersecurity conference in China. And they have a pwn-to-own competition, a competition where you're supposed to break into stuff for prizes. This was actually invented out of a Canadian conference, but has become a popular thing that happens around the world. In this conference, you've got Chinese hackers from all of these private companies going and coming up with full exploit chains, complete working exploits that they demonstrated for Microsoft Windows, for Apple iOS, for VMware's enterprise products, for Office 365, for Adobe Acrobat, like the entire list of the critical pieces of software that sit on hundreds of millions of American computers. These are the bugs that they were willing to burn in public for a prize of $100,000 to $200,000, right? This isn't like the magic stuff that they keep back at the MSS. When you combine this with the examples that we have of the use of full iOS kill chains against Uyghur dissidents, the capabilities that they've deployed against their own citizens, Chinese capabilities on the offensive space are incredibly, incredibly strong, and the quality of American software is incredibly weak. And this is something I think we have to focus on. Is one, we are now the underdog, to be honest, on cyber, right? We are the underdog. There's all this discussion as if we're still the big 800-pound gorilla. And I know NSA and Cyber Command have great offensive capabilities, but if you look at what just private industry can do in China, they are kicking our butts. And that has to be part of our strategy to act as the underdog, to find asymmetries that we can benefit, to build up our public security research capabilities. And there's a number of ways we can do that, but then also to motivate American companies to build better software. And I don't think we should just like have strict liability on software quality, but we're gonna have to start to turn the knob up, that there are motivations for companies to finally invest much more deeply in software security through requiring, bug bounty programs, requiring certain kinds of disclosure things, clearing up American law so that American security researchers are not disadvantaged versus their Chinese competitors. Right now, the Supreme Court is considering an interpretation of the CFAA that would basically make the security research that happened at the Tianfu Cup illegal to happen in the United States. That's ridiculous. If the Supreme Court rules that way, then Congress has to fix it. That has to be part of our strategy, is because right now, all of the software that all of us are using on our computers, it turns out if you just run a competition in China, some folks can walk in and walk away with a bug for $100,000, and that the Chinese government is so confident of their capabilities that they allow that to happen in public.
Hey, Alex, do you think that I'm sorry, Susan, but do you think that it's, after the 1929 stock market crash, that's when you see the SEC come along, that's when you see the introduction of generally accepted accounting principles? Because the recognition was the decisions being made by those companies actually did affect national security. Do you think now's the time that we could maybe come up with that joint independent body that's part private sector, part government, that says, no, you want to be a public company? You've got to have a certain set of security principles that are applied. And maybe that is part about the software and part it is about the defense. Maybe it's time for that.
Yeah, no, I think it is time for us to have a regulatory function that I'm going to keep on going back to the airplane safety, because I think that's where first America led, right? We led in the invention of the airplane, we led in the commercialization of airlines, and we led in airline safety, of having a public-private partnership around public investigations, public airing of grievances, of people promising to do better. The regulation's a little tough because it's adversarial, right? So you can't just come up with like, if you follow these rules, your software is secure. But what you can do is you can create the motivations for a much broader set of companies to invest and to make security their number one. And we've drifted away from that for sure.
So I apologize, my neighbor has chosen this moment to do very loud yard work outside, but in order to uphold my my audience obligation, I'll sort of throw, maybe to you, Sue, for the last word. I think this is a paraphrase of the question, but how do we think about kind of developing the cyber talent workforce, right? So we experience a huge amount of sort of brain drain from the government. People go into work for places like Alex's former employer. Alex, to the extent there's a need for partnerships sending people into the government, how should we be thinking about that issue?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that you could do. Number one, I think you could do something like an ROTC program where you fund it as part of the educational process. You give them a background, you give them a clearance, and all they have to do is agree to go into the business, whether in the private sector or in the government, into the national security business. You absolutely have to deal with security clearance reform. We have to make it so that people can move between places. And if you could move between places, I guarantee you everyone's best first 5 years would be with the government, and you wouldn't have any trouble, because you get so much of an inoculation into what the real issues are. You do great purpose, you have great responsibility, do that for a little bit. And then if you could take your talent and go out and refresh it and then come back, I think we would be able to use it pretty well. So those are a couple of things I do.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would add, I think those are fantastic ideas. I'd love to see the defensive side of the government try to get equal to the offensive side. I've hired, as you can imagine, dozens of ex-NSA, ex-Cyber Command hackers, and they're fantastic. You just don't see as good quality on the defensive side. I think part of it is NSA and Cyber Command have an ROTC, right? They go, I actually got a letter when I was 18 offering a scholarship. I didn't need it, but there's a lot of people who they grab at 18, 19, and then they bring them through college. They give them a sense of mission, and then they get 5 or 6 really productive years out of them. I'd like to see CISA do the same thing. CISA's got great people, but they don't have the technical depth of like an NSA or Cyber Command, and we need the defensive people to be just as good.
So that brings us 1 minute over time. So we will wrap it up. This is the last session for today. So I have the job of sort of wrapping everything up. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to Sue and Alex for this really great conversation. The next session is going to begin tomorrow at noon with the director of the Secret Service. So thank you again for joining us.